Hi everyone, welcome to the Red Umbrella channel. I hope you're all doing well. Today we'll be looking at one insane theory for every Family Guy season that'll keep your brain turning while you drift off. But before we begin, I'd just like to kindly ask you all to subscribe. It's completely free and it really helps us improve the videos for this wonderful community we've managed to build. Anyway, that's enough, let's begin. Alright, let's kick things off with a theory so dark, so twisted, so fundamentally universe-shattering that it makes the Pixar theory look like a bedtime story for toddlers. We're talking about the very first episode of Family Guy ever aired. Death Has a Shadow introduced us to Peter Griffin, the lovable idiot who would go on to define a generation of adult animation. Sounds innocent enough, right? Just a wacky pilot episode about a guy who loses his job and commits welfare fraud. Classic sitcom shenanigans. Except here's the thing. What if Peter Griffin died in that very first episode? What if the entire series, all 23 seasons of it, every cutaway gag, every chicken fight, every time Stewie threatened to kill Lois, has been Peter's personal purgatory, a never-ending loop of consequence-free chaos designed specifically for a man who drank himself to death at a stag party? The episode opens with Peter heading off to a bachelor party, despite promising Lois he won't drink. She makes him swear on everything holy. Not a drop of alcohol is going to touch these lips tonight. Cut to the stag party, and the very first thing we see is Peter participating in a game literally called Drink the Beer. His friend asks who wants to play. Peter volunteers, chugs an entire beer, and wins. His prize? Another beer. The man is speedrunning liver failure like it's a category at Games Done Quick. The next morning, Lois confronts him with the damage report: 37 beers in one night. The average human body can process roughly one standard drink per hour. Peter consumed 37 in what appears to be a single evening, and the math here points to one conclusion that rhymes with alcohol moisening. The show plays this off as a hangover gag. Peter clutches his head and describes it as accountants cranking adding machines in my head, which leads to a cutaway of tiny accountants doing exactly that inside his skull. Haha, funny visual metaphor for a headache. Except, what if that visual metaphor is actually showing us Peter's brain cells dying? What if we're watching the internal experience of a man whose body is actively shutting down? Peter then loses his job because he fell asleep at work, still wrecked from the party. He lies to Lois about getting fired, discovers a clerical error that gives him $150,000 a week in welfare payments, and goes on a spending spree that would make a lottery winner blush. He buys a moat around his house, rents Michelangelo's David, and breaks the penis off while loading it into his car, gets Meg collagen lip injections, and hires a professional jester. Biblical excess from a man with zero impulse control. The episode ends with Peter facing welfare fraud charges, Lois giving an impassioned speech, and baby Stewie mind-controlling the judge into letting everyone go free. Consequences erased. Slate wiped clean. Everything returns to exactly how it was before. And here's the critical question. When has anything in Family Guy ever had lasting consequences? Characters die and come back. Brian gets hit by a car and the show literally travels through time to undo it. Peter has been shot, stabbed, mauled, and subjected to physical trauma that would kill most fictional characters several times over, and he walks it off by the next episode. The Griffin family exists in a state of perpetual stasis where Meg is always in high school, Stewie is always 1 year old, and Chris is eternally 13. Purgatory works the same way. The Catholic concept of purgatory describes it as a state of temporary punishment where souls are purified before entering heaven, operating on its own timeline where what feels like years might be moments. Peter Griffin has been living the same basic life for over 2 decades of our time, with the same house, same job, and same family dynamic. And who's the one character who keeps showing up to remind Peter of his mortality? Death himself, who appears as a recurring character throughout the series, lives in Quahog, hangs out at the same bars as Peter, and has crashed at the Griffin house so many times he's basically family. Why would Death be so familiar with one random Rhode Island man unless that man had already crossed over? The stag party was the night Peter Griffin died. His body gave out somewhere around beer 32. His spirit separated from his mortal coil, and he woke up in a version of Quahog designed to process his soul. Everything after exists in a pocket dimension where normal rules become optional, where a baby can build time machines, a dog can drive a car, and a fat man can fight a chicken for 11 uninterrupted minutes and level half the city. Peter's test is obvious once you see it. He's a man who prioritizes immediate pleasure over long-term consequences. So purgatory gives him infinite chances to try again. Every episode is a new test, every reset is a new opportunity to do better, and every time Peter chooses the beer and makes the same mistakes. The chicken fights represent his internal battle against his worst impulses. The treatment of Meg reflects his guilt over being a bad father given physical form, and the Conway Twitty cutaways are moments where purgatory itself gets bored of testing him. 23 seasons later, Peter Griffin keeps waking up in Quahog, keeps drinking at the Drunken Clam, and keeps watching death wave from across the street. 37 beers killed him, and everything else has just been cosmic processing time while the universe figures out what to do with a man who's too stupid for hell and too flawed for heaven. Now let's move on to the next season, and this one changes everything. Season 2. Most fans write off to Boom as a throwaway gag episode. Nukes fall, the Griffins trek across a wasteland to find a Twinkie factory, Stewie turns into an octopus, and then the whole thing gets revealed as a dream sequence from a Dallas character. Haha, very meta, very 90s, moving on. Except, what if the show accidentally told us the truth and then covered it up with the laziest narrative cop-out in television history? What if the apocalypse actually happened, created a branching timeline, and the main Family Guy universe we've been watching ever since carries permanent scars from that nuclear hellscape bleeding through? Peter gets warned by a giant chicken, yes, that chicken, more on him later, that the world will end at midnight on January 1st, 2000. He drags his family into the basement with radiation suits, while everyone else parties at Quagmire's. The clock strikes midnight, missiles launch themselves in a pattern that literally spells out the date across the sky, and civilization collapses. The Griffins emerge into a wasteland where Tom Tucker and Diane Simmons are literally eating Asian reporter Trisha Takanawa because they're just gonna be hungry again in an hour. Dark stuff for a cartoon that also features a talking baby complaining he looks like a gay Neil Armstrong. The family travels to Natick, Massachusetts to find a Twinkie factory, and they actually succeed. They build New Quahog, a functioning society with schools, hospitals, and a theater where Cleveland performs one-man shows about breakfast at Tiffany's. Stewie mutates into an octopus after playing in nuclear waste. Joe Swanson gets literally melted into his driveway. Quagmire and Cleveland fuse into a single being called Quagland, depending on who you ask. These mutations happen over what appears to be weeks of post-apocalyptic life, establishing a fully realized alternate timeline with its own rules, geography, and mutated character designs. Peter becomes mayor, implements a job lottery system, and eventually gets overthrown for prioritizing guns over water infrastructure. An entire civilization rises and falls in the span of 22 minutes, which is either rushed storytelling or evidence that this timeline kept existing long after the episode ended. The show tries to erase all of this with a cut to Pam Ewing from Dallas waking up and saying the whole thing was a dream. Bobby asks, "What's Family Guy?" And we're supposed to laugh and forget everything. Except the Dallas dream sequence reference is suspicious as hell. In Dallas, that exact trick was used to undo an entire season of storyline the writers regretted. Family Guy is literally telling us, we're using the most infamous timeline erasing moment in television history. Why reference that specific show unless you're doing the same thing and hoping nobody notices? The writers basically held up a sign saying, "We're cheating," and expected the audience to be too distracted by the meta humor to question what they were covering up. The bleed-through evidence starts piling up in subsequent seasons. Quahog's geography becomes wildly inconsistent after Season 2, with buildings and landmarks appearing and disappearing between episodes. The Drunken Clam changes location. The Griffin house sits on different streets depending on who's drawing it. Neighboring houses appear and vanish like quantum particles uncertain about their own existence. Characters reference events that never happened on screen or forget major life moments that definitely did. Brian has multiple origin stories that contradict each other. Stewie's intelligence level fluctuates between can build a time machine and can't figure out a child safety lock. These inconsistencies get hand-waved as cartoon logic, but cartoon logic has rules too, and Family Guy breaks its own rules constantly in ways that suggest something fundamental about the universe got scrambled. The giant chicken who warned Peter about the apocalypse in the first place keeps returning for increasingly destructive fights that level entire city blocks, and nobody permanently acknowledges the damage. These fights feel less like recurring gags and more like two versions of reality violently colliding, with Peter and his nemesis literally punching holes through Quahog, trying to establish which timeline gets to be real. The chicken knew about the apocalypse before it happened. The chicken gave Peter a coupon that started their rivalry. The chicken might be an entity that exists across multiple timelines simultaneously, which would explain why their battles transcend normal physics and why neither of them can ever truly die. Stewie's characterization shifts dramatically after this episode, going from genuinely homicidal evil genius to a more flamboyant baby who occasionally remembers he used to want world domination. The octopus mutation might explain this. What if some version of mutant Stewie's consciousness bled back into the main timeline, diluting his evil with the trauma of having been transformed into a tentacled freak? His obsession with his own body, his sexuality, his place in the world, could all stem from cellular memory of that nuclear transformation echoing across realities. The Stewie who built doomsday devices and genuinely tried to murder Lois got overwritten by a Stewie who experienced something so horrifying that world domination stopped seeming important. The Randy Newman gag deserves special attention too. The family stops at an apple farm where Newman sits narrating everything he sees in song form. Fat man with his kids and dog drove in through the morning fog. The Griffins flee in horror, but right before the Dallas reset, the whole family starts singing left foot, right foot as they walk. Newman's song infected them. His narration became their reality. Family Guy uses musical numbers constantly in later seasons, characters breaking into song to describe their situations without any prompting or explanation. The Randy Newman virus from the Apocalypse timeline might have permanently altered how the show's universe processes reality, turning everyone into potential narrators of their own existence. Every time Peter breaks into a show tune about his current situation, that's the Wasteland timeline's influence leaking through. The episode also establishes that Twinkies and cockroaches are the only things that survive nuclear holocaust, which Peter treats as common knowledge. He saw this on A&E, he claims, in a biography about Twinkie the Kid that includes interviews with the snack cake's parents discussing how their son had no bones and couldn't really play any sports. This mockumentary about a fictional mascot's childhood trauma somehow aired on a channel dedicated to real biographies. Either Peter is misremembering something he saw before the blast, or the Apocalypse timeline has its own version of television history, where A&E makes documentaries about sentient junk food. Both possibilities suggest reality and that timeline operates on fundamentally different rules than ours. 23 seasons later, Quahog remains a town where nothing makes geographic or temporal sense, where characters die and return without explanation, where entire buildings exist or vanish depending on the episode's needs. The Dallas reset taught the nightmare how to hide, and every continuity error you've ever noticed is just the wasteland trying to merge back in. New Quahog is still out there somewhere, its mutated citizens still rebuilding after the octopus army attack, still wondering what happened to the fat man who founded their city and then vanished into a dream that someone else was having. Alright, on to the next season. Trust me, you won't expect what happens here. Season 3. Brian Griffin walks on two legs, drives a Prius, writes novels that nobody reads, drinks martinis at the family dinner table, and once dated a human woman for an entire season without anyone in Quahog finding it particularly strange. The show plays this off as cartoon logic, the same suspended disbelief that lets a baby build time machines and a fat man survive monthly chicken-induced explosions. Except Brian exists in a world where other dogs are just dogs. We see them throughout the series, normal canines who bark and sniff and do regular dog things. Seabreeze, the prize-winning racing dog that Brian impregnates in Screwed the Pooch, acts like an actual animal. She runs on four legs, doesn't speak, and gets entered into greyhound competitions. Brian looks at her and falls in love, which raises some uncomfortable questions about his own nature that the show desperately wants us to ignore. The government experiment theory explains everything the cartoon logic excuse leaves hanging. Brian was engineered in a laboratory, enhanced with human-level intelligence and the physical capability to walk upright, then released into the world as part of some classified program that Quahog's residents are either unaware of or conditioned to accept. His alcoholism, his pretentious literary aspirations, his chronic depression, all of these read differently when you consider them as side effects of experimental enhancement rather than quirky character traits. The dog who quotes Nietzsche and debates religion with Stewie might be doing so because scientists spliced human cognitive genes into his DNA and left him to figure out existence without any support system. Screwed the Pooch drops some fascinating breadcrumbs about Brian's origins that the show never picks back up. Carter Pewterschmidt, Lois's obscenely wealthy father, owns Seabreeze and treats her like property because she is property. She's a racing dog, a investment, a biological machine designed to win competitions and produce valuable offspring. Carter has the resources and connections to access experimental breeding programs, the kind of black-budget projects that billionaires fund through shell corporations and military contracts. When Brian shows up and compromises his prize asset, Carter's reaction goes beyond anger at property damage. He launches a legal campaign to separate Brian from his potential puppies with the intensity of someone protecting classified information. The custody trial sequence reveals how the legal system of Quahog treats Brian as something between human and animal, a gray area that only makes sense if there's precedent for enhanced creatures existing in this universe. Brian gets to testify, hire lawyers, and fight for parental rights, privileges that no normal dog would receive regardless of how smart cartoon logic made them. The court ultimately rules that Brian can have custody if he agrees to be neutered, a compromise that treats his reproductive capability as dangerous enough to warrant surgical intervention. Why would the state care about preventing Brian from breeding unless they knew what he was capable of passing on to offspring? The episode ends with a twist that conveniently sidesteps the entire question. Seabreeze's puppies turn out to belong to another dog, meaning Brian's genetics never got passed on at all. Ted Turner, who appears at Carter's poker game alongside Bill Gates and Michael Eisner, makes a comment about ethnically cleansing the Small World ride at Disneyland. The billionaire class in Family Guy operates with casual sociopathy, treating population control and genetic purity as dinner conversation. These are the people who would fund a talking dog program just to see if they could, then abandon the results to fend for themselves in suburban Rhode Island. Brian's father shows up in a later episode as a completely normal dog, dead and stuffed in a museum. His mother is never mentioned. The show treats this as a sad revelation about Brian's abandonment issues, but the logistics make zero sense unless you factor in artificial enhancement. A regular dog and a regular dog produce Brian, who somehow developed human speech, bipedal movement, and the emotional complexity to write a memoir about his drinking problem? Either Brian's mother was also an experiment, or the government took a normal puppy and upgraded him before returning him to the wild like some kind of canine super soldier program that ran out of funding. Throughout the series, Brian demonstrates capabilities that fluctuate wildly depending on plot requirements. He can drive, shoot guns, operate complex machinery, and navigate human social situations with moderate competence. He also reverts to dog behavior at random moments, humping legs, eating garbage, and getting distracted by squirrels mid-conversation. This inconsistency tracks with experimental enhancement that didn't fully take, a prototype who functions at 60% human capability with random system crashes back to baseline canine programming. The scientists got close enough to call it a success, then classified the project and moved on to the next iteration. Quahog accepts Brian because Quahog has been conditioned to accept Brian. The same town that shrugs off monthly apocalyptic destruction and a baby who openly discusses world dominated probably received some kind of mass suggestion that talking dogs are normal. The government that created Brian would need to ensure his integration, and small-scale memory alteration is exactly the kind of program that Family Guy's shadowy power structure would implement without anyone noticing. Every resident who meets Brian and doesn't immediately question his existence is providing evidence that something larger is controlling the narrative, keeping the experiment hidden in plain sight until whoever funded it decides what to do with the data. Let's move into the next season. This is where things really get wild. Season 4. Peter Griffin gets officially declared mentally retarded in Petarded after taking an IQ test, scoring just below the threshold for functional intelligence. The state assigns him a social worker, takes away his children, and the entire episode treats his cognitive limitations as a fixed medical diagnosis. Except anyone who's watched more than 3 episodes of this show knows Peter has demonstrated genuine competence, strategic thinking, and occasional flashes of brilliance that completely contradict a static low IQ. The man who can't identify the color of a fire truck is the same man who read Ted Turner's poker tell well enough to win a hand against billionaires, who tied a perfect bowline knot on Carter Pewterschmidt's yacht, who orchestrated elaborate schemes requiring multi-step planning and social manipulation. The diagnosis makes no sense unless Peter's intelligence genuinely fluctuates, and the most likely explanation is an undiagnosed neurological condition that causes his cognitive abilities to swing wildly, depending on factors nobody in Quahog has ever thought to monitor. The episode itself provides evidence for this theory if you watch closely. Peter wins at Trivial Pursuit before the IQ test, answering questions that Lois secretly swapped for preschool-level prompts. He gets asked to say the word "what" and nearly fails, cycling through "who" and Fantastic Four before landing on the correct answer by accident. This reads like a man whose brain genuinely glitched mid-sentence, unable to process a simple instruction despite understanding the game mechanics well enough to play competitively. The IQ test happens the next day, catching Peter at what might be his cognitive low point, and suddenly he's legally classified as mentally deficient. Had the test occurred after a good night's sleep or during one of his inexplicable competence spikes, the results could have been completely different. Head trauma offers the most compelling explanation for Peter's fluctuating intelligence. The man has sustained more cranial damage than an NFL linebacker across 23 seasons of chicken fights, car accidents, falls from heights, and direct impacts to the skull. His very first chicken fight in Season 2 established a pattern of brutal physical comedy that would repeat dozens of times, each battle involving punches to the head, crashes through walls, and impacts that should cause permanent brain damage. Chronic traumatic encephalopathy causes exactly the kind of symptoms Peter displays: mood swings, impulsive behavior, memory problems, and cognitive inconsistency that varies day to day. Football players with CTE report good days where they feel sharp and bad days where they can't remember their children's names. Peter Griffin lives that reality without anyone in his life connecting the dots. The competence spikes deserve closer examination because they're genuinely impressive when they happen. Peter figures out that Ted Turner blinks twice when he lies, a tell subtle enough that billionaires who play poker regularly never noticed it. He identifies sailing terminology and performs technical knot work that impresses Carter Pewterschmidt, a man who hates him and would never offer false praise. He plans and executes schemes that require understanding other people's psychology, predicting their reactions, and adapting when things go wrong. These moments get played for laughs, the dumb guy accidentally being smart, but they occur too frequently and require too much genuine cognitive function to dismiss as luck. Peter's brain clearly works when it decides to work. The fluctuation pattern might explain why Lois stays married to him despite the constant humiliation and property damage. She fell in love with a version of Peter capable of charm, competence, and emotional connection. That Peter still exists, emerging unpredictably between episodes of profound stupidity. Lois holds on to the marriage because she keeps seeing glimpses of the man she married, never knowing when he'll show up or how long he'll stay. Her patience makes more sense when you frame it as hope rather than resignation, a wife waiting for her husband's good days and managing the damage during his bad ones. The same logic applies to his friendships, his job, and his ability to maintain any kind of functional life despite behavior that should have gotten him institutionalized years ago. The doctor who delivers Peter's IQ results in Petarded never suggests follow-up testing, brain scans, or investigation into why a functioning adult suddenly qualifies as mentally retarded. The medical establishment in Quahog treats the diagnosis as permanent and immediately moves to legal consequences, removing Peter's children and assigning him supervised care. This negligence tracks with a healthcare system that either doesn't understand variable cognitive conditions or doesn't care enough to investigate them. Peter gets slotted into a bureaucratic category and left there, his occasional genius dismissed as irrelevant because it doesn't show up on standardized tests administered at random moments. The episode ends with everything returning to normal, Peter's children restored, his legal status apparently unchanged despite no evidence of improved cognitive function. Quahog's institutions prove just as inconsistent as Peter himself, enforcing consequences when convenient and forgetting about them when the plot demands resolution. This mirrors how everyone in Peter's life treats his intelligence, acknowledging it when useful, ignoring it when inconvenient, never investigating why the same man can be brilliant Tuesday and brain-dead Wednesday. Peter Griffin lives with a condition that nobody around him takes seriously enough to diagnose, bouncing between competence and catastrophe, while his family pretends this is just how things are. 23 seasons of evidence sits right there, waiting for a doctor smart enough to order an MRI. Before we move on, if this video's been helpful, consider subscribing. It costs nothing and it helps us make better content for you. Now, back to it. Now we're heading into the next season, and it might be the craziest one yet. Season 5. Stewie Griffin finally does it. After years of matricidal threats, failed assassination attempts, and monologues about destroying the woman who birthed him, he actually pulls the trigger. Stewie Kills Lois ends with Stewie shooting his mother on a cruise ship and watching her fall into the ocean. Part 2 shows the aftermath. Peter gets framed for murder, stands trial, faces life imprisonment, and then Lois dramatically returns to reveal she survived and identifies Stewie as her attacker. Stewie responds by seizing control of the entire world, becoming a dictator, and ultimately dying in a confrontation with Lois herself. Then the show pulls its trump card. The whole thing was a simulation Stewie ran on his computer to see what would happen if he actually went through with killing his mother. Haha, none of it was real. Status quo restored. Roll credits. Except the simulation explanation creates more problems than it solves. Stewie's computer somehow predicted exact dialogue from characters he's never had private conversations with, showed events occurring in locations he's never visited, and generated psychological responses from family members that he couldn't possibly model with any accuracy. The simulation knew what Peter would say at the captain's table, knew the exact abortion story he'd tell to horrify wealthy strangers, knew how he'd react to being accused of murder. It knew what Meg would do, alone in her room, when she thought nobody was watching, generating a deeply uncomfortable masturbation joke that Stewie would have no data to predict. It knew how Brian would investigate the murder independently, the specific clues he'd find, the conclusions he'd draw. Either Stewie built the most advanced predictive AI in human history, one that makes his time machine look like a calculator, or the simulation was tapping into something real. The multiverse exists in Family Guy. Brian and Stewie visit alternate realities in Road to the Multiverse just a few seasons later, hopping between universes where dogs rule humans, where everything looks like a Disney cartoon, where the show never got canceled. The infrastructure for parallel timelines already exists in this universe. The simulation might have been a window into an actual timeline where Stewie followed through, and young Stewie watched his alternate self become a monster while believing he was running a sophisticated computer program. The technology for viewing alternate realities would look exactly like a simulation to someone who didn't understand what they'd built. Stewie might have accidentally invented interdimensional observation and misidentified it as predictive modeling. The psychological aftermath tracks perfectly with this interpretation. Pre-simulation Stewie spent every episode plotting world domination, building weapons of mass destruction, and articulating detailed fantasies about Lois's death. The baby who debuted threatening to destroy his mother with a mind control device meant every word of his villainous monologues. His hatred felt genuine, his intelligence felt dangerous, and his eventual success seemed inevitable. Post-simulation Stewie gradually becomes a different character entirely. His evil schemes get played for laughs rather than menace. His relationship with Brian shifts from reluctant alliance to genuine friendship, built on mutual respect and emotional vulnerability. His sexuality becomes a running joke rather than something the show ignores, with Stewie openly discussing attraction to men while maintaining plausible deniability about his orientation. The homicidal baby evolves into a witty, emotionally complex character who occasionally remembers he used to want to conquer the world, but can't quite recall why it mattered so much. Fans attribute this to Flanderization, the show softening its edges for mainstream appeal, the writers getting bored with evil Stewie and finding more comedy in gay Stewie. The simulation theory offers a darker explanation. Stewie saw exactly who he would become if he succeeded, and it traumatized him into becoming someone else. He watched himself turn into a dictator who executed people casually, who ruled through fear, who trusted nobody and connected with nothing. The baby genius who wanted power discovered that power meant loneliness, paranoia, and eventually death at the hands of the mother he thought he hated. The dictator Stewie from the simulation achieves everything baby Stewie claimed to want. World domination, Lois eliminated, the family under his control, humanity bowing to his genius. And it means nothing. He spends his time as supreme ruler giving press conferences and making enemies, isolated in a position that allows no vulnerability or connection. Brian confronts him about the murder and Stewie responds with cold dismissal, having lost the capacity for the banter that defined their relationship. When Lois returns and ultimately kills him, dictator Stewie dies alone in his own home, shot by the woman whose death started everything, surrounded by the wealth and power that failed to make him happy. If baby Stewie genuinely experienced this outcome, even through what he believed was a simulation interface, witnessing his own empty victory and lonely death would constitute the kind of psychological break that changes a person fundamentally. Brian's role in the simulation deserves attention because it predicts their future relationship with eerie accuracy. Simulation Brian investigates Lois's disappearance, suspects Stewie immediately, and works to expose him despite the personal danger. He finds evidence, confronts Stewie directly, and refuses to be intimidated by threats. He functions as Stewie's moral opposition, the one character who sees through him completely and challenges him anyway. In later seasons, Brian becomes exactly this person in Stewie's actual life. The friend who calls him on his bullshit, who refuses to enable his worst impulses, who treats him as a person capable of growth, rather than a baby to be coddled or a threat to be feared. The simulation showed Stewie what he needed most, an equal who would hold him accountable, and he spent the rest of the series unconsciously seeking it out. Their road trip episodes become the emotional core of the show, Two characters who shouldn't work as friends, discovering genuine affection through shared experience. The timeline where Lois dies continues existing somewhere in the multiverse. Its version of Stewie dead on the floor of the Griffin living room. Its version of the family processing trauma that our Stewie only observed through a screen. Every multiverse episode after this two-parter reinforces that alternate realities are real, persistent, and populated by versions of the characters who experience genuine consequences. Disney Stewie exists. Dog-ruled world Stewie exists. The Stewie who conquered Earth and died for it exists too, in a timeline that branched off the moment the trigger got pulled on that cruise ship. The simulation wasn't a hypothetical exercise in predictive computing. It was tourism to a universe where the worst version of Stewie won everything and lost himself. Baby Stewie took a vacation to his own dark future, watched the entire thing play out over what felt like a year of subjective time, experienced his alternate self's rise and fall in vivid detail, and came back fundamentally altered. The gradual softening of his character across subsequent seasons represents the long psychological recovery from witnessing his own corruption and death, a process that takes years of screen time and never quite completes. Sometimes he still builds weapons, sometimes he still threatens Lois, but the conviction is gone, replaced by performance and habit. The baby who saw himself become a monster decided, consciously or not, to become something else instead. The simulation saved Stewie from himself by showing him exactly what himself would become without intervention. Time to move on to the next season. This is where it all flips. Season 6, Peter Griffin eats 30 hamburgers from McBertown in a single sitting and suffers a massive stroke that paralyzes half his body. The episode plays this as a cautionary tale about fast food excess, Peter suing the company, losing in court, then going undercover to expose their slaughterhouse practices. Standard corporate satire, right? A fat guy eats too much, gets sick, blames the restaurant, learns a lesson about personal responsibility, while also revealing that the company does shady things. Except the details of McBertown's operation suggest something far more sinister than a typical fast food chain cutting corners on health standards. The slaughterhouse Peter discovers operates like a concentration camp, complete with a cow who makes Holocaust jokes about the facility being called Dachau. The company has areas marked off-limits to visitors, guards who chase intruders, and a general manager who casually mentions needing 30-minute bathroom breaks because he eats a lot of meat. This level of secrecy and security for a burger chain suggests McBertown protects something more valuable than trade secrets about special sauce. The shadow organization theory connects McBertown to Quahog's most persistent mystery. Why does everyone in this town act so strange? Residents forget major life events between episodes, accept talking babies and dogs without question, tolerate property destruction that would bankrupt most cities, and demonstrate collective behavioral patterns that defy normal human psychology. Mass manipulation through food supply would explain all of it. McBertown's hamburgers could contain compounds that affect memory, suppress critical thinking, and increase suggestibility in the general population. Peter eating 30 of them at once essentially overdosed on whatever they're putting in the meat, causing a neurological event that the company never anticipated because nobody was supposed to consume that quantity in a single meal. Peter's brain short-circuited because it received 30 times the intended dose of cognitive suppression chemicals, and his neural pathways couldn't handle the load. The episode reveals that McBertown has existed since 1952, when their value meal consisted of a hamburger, a cup of coffee, and a Lucky Strike. The company has been operating in Quahog for over 50 years, plenty of time to establish infrastructure for population-wide influence. Their original menu combining food, caffeine, and nicotine suggests early experimentation with addictive substance delivery through casual dining. The Lucky Strike inclusion means McBertown partnered with tobacco companies during the era when cigarette manufacturers actively researched addiction science and psychological manipulation. Whatever they learned about hooking customers on cigarettes could have been applied to hamburgers, creating a product that Quahog residents feel compelled to consume without understanding why. Their test marketing of Meaty, the quick-to-anger clown, a mascot so psychologically unstable that he screams at children for incomplete responses, suggests the company experiments with behavioral triggers in their branding. The mascot yells, "There was more to my question," at a child who simply expressed enthusiasm for hamburgers, punishing normal social behavior with explosive rage. They're testing how much aggression and instability the public will accept from authority figures, normalizing erratic behavior through mascot exposure, before implementing it in other aspects of Quahog's social structure. If children grow up thinking angry clowns who punish them for insufficient responses are normal, they'll accept the same treatment from teachers, police, and government officials without resistance. The cow who testifies against McBertown provides crucial evidence that the company's operations transcend normal corporate evil. This cow speaks fluent English, demonstrates philosophical sophistication, references historical atrocities, and has maintained his identity despite living in conditions designed to break prisoners psychologically. He describes watching his wife get slaughtered and still musters the composure to deliver coherent testimony and make darkly ironic jokes about genocide. Either McBertown accidentally created sentient cattle through their feeding practices, or they've been experimenting with cognitive enhancement on livestock for decades. If their feed can make cows intelligent enough to deliver courtroom testimony and make references to concentration camps, imagine what their hamburgers do to the humans who consume them. The intelligence enhancement might work differently across species, making cows smarter while making humans more compliant and forgetful. The same compound that grants cattle self-awareness could suppress those qualities in human neurology. Peter's stroke recovery happens through stem cell therapy that takes exactly 5 minutes, restoring full function to his paralyzed body with a simple injection. He emerges from the treatment asking, "Why are we not funding this?" as if miraculous medical technology just appeared without explanation. The therapy exists, works perfectly, and remains unavailable to the general public, despite its obvious applications for stroke victims, paralysis patients, and countless other conditions. Someone is controlling access to cures while allowing the diseases to proliferate. McBertown causes strokes through their food, then the medical establishment withholds the instant treatment that could fix the damage. The same shadow organization likely controls both ends of this pipeline, creating health problems and profiting from incomplete solutions, while keeping the real cures reserved for people who matter. Peter gets access because the plot requires it, but the show never explains how a working-class Rhode Island family affords or locates experimental stem cell treatment that the rest of America apparently cannot access. The Quahog Mustache Society that Peter joins earlier in the episode operates on the same secretive principles as McBertown's inner workings. Password-protected meetings, recognition signals between members, discussions about sending cards to prominent mustache wearers, and a catalog of products designed to identify fellow initiates. Peter gains access to this society simply by growing facial hair, suggesting that surface-level conformity grants entry to exclusive groups throughout Quahog. The society members immediately recognize each other on the street, calling out across traffic to acknowledge their shared affiliation. McBertown's management likely belongs to similar organizations, interconnected clubs and societies that share members and coordinate activities beneath the notice of regular citizens. The town runs on secret handshakes and hidden affiliations, with fast food franchises serving as one node in a larger network of control. The episode ends with the cow having nowhere to go after his testimony, awkwardly standing in the Griffin living room while Peter backpedals on promises of shelter. A witness who exposed corporate atrocities gets abandoned by the person who convinced him to speak out. No witness protection, no relocation assistance, no follow-up from authorities who should be investigating the slaughterhouse revelations. The system absorbs the testimony and changes nothing. McBertown suffers a publicity setback, not criminal charges or shutdown orders. The shadow organization protected its asset, sacrificed some public reputation, and continued operating. By next episode, Quahog residents will be eating McBertown hamburgers again, their memories of the scandal fading like everything else fades in a town where nobody remembers yesterday unless the plot requires it. The cow's brave testimony amounts to nothing, his wife's death remains unavenged, and the slaughterhouse keeps running. That's how shadow organizations work. They let you think you've won, then continue exactly as before while you celebrate a victory that never actually happened. Let's jump into the next season. You'll never look at the show the same way after this. Season 7. Meg Griffin catches the mumps and spends 5 days bedridden, watching nothing but the religion channel because her father gave her a broken television that only receives one station. During this isolation, she discovers Kirk Cameron's evangelical programming and emerges from her illness a completely different person, quoting scripture, demanding grace before meals, and attempting to convert her entire family to Christianity. The episode treats this as a joke about religious fanaticism, with Meg eventually abandoning her faith after Brian points out that God gave her a flat chest, a fat ass, and a family that doesn't respect her. Haha, silly Meg and her silly phase. Except, the show never actually disproves anything Meg experienced. Brian talks her out of belief using insults about her appearance, and that's supposed to resolve the theological question of whether Meg encountered something real during her illness. The theory proposes that Meg's religious awakening wasn't brainwashing from daytime television. Meg actually perceived something genuine during those 5 days of fever and isolation, something that exists in Quahog's reality that her family members are too spiritually blind to see. Her constant suffering throughout the series makes sense if she's the only Griffin aware of the true nature of their existence. She sees the horror, feels the wrongness, understands on some level that Quahog operates according to rules that shouldn't apply to a normal American town. Everyone else walks around oblivious, while Meg carries the weight of perception that nobody asked for and nobody validates. The mumps created the conditions for spiritual breakthrough. Meg spent 5 days in a fever state, isolated from family interaction, receiving minimal care from parents who forgot to vaccinate her in the first place because Lois couldn't be bothered with anything that didn't involve Dan Cortez in 1992. Sensory deprivation combined with illness has triggered genuine religious experiences throughout human history. Shamans fast and isolate themselves to receive visions. Mystics describe fever dreams that reveal divine truth. Meg, abandoned in her room with a broken television and a bowl of soup, accidentally recreated the conditions that produce prophets. Kirk Cameron didn't brainwash her. Kirk Cameron just happened to be talking when the veil lifted, and Meg saw what was really there. Her behavior after the illness suggests genuine contact with something beyond normal perception. Meg demonstrates confidence, authority, and a sense of purpose that never appears in any other episode. The girl who usually apologizes for existing suddenly demands that her family hold hands for grace, commands Brian to believe in God because she has dominion over you, and marches into public spaces to spread her message without the social anxiety that normally cripples her. Something gave Meg power during those 5 days, and the power didn't come from watching a former sitcom actor talk about Jesus. The power came from whatever Meg actually encountered. While her fever-addled brain was open to frequencies the healthy mind blocks out. The episode confirms that supernatural entities exist in Quahog and interact with the physical world. Stewie builds a functional transporter that summons the entire cast of Star Trek: The Next Generation to his living room. The technology works. Patrick Stewart and the others spend an entire day being dragged around town by a talking baby, eating at McDonald's, bowling, and generally experiencing forced tourism before Stewie sends them home. If transporters work, if the fabric of reality can be manipulated by a 1-year-old with a blueprint from a convention, then Meg's perception of divine presence becomes significantly more plausible. Quahog already operates on rules that allow impossible things. Why would God be the exception? Brian's atheism serves as the episode's counterweight to Meg's faith, but Brian's arguments amount to personal attacks rather than theological reasoning. He tells Meg that God wouldn't have given her an ugly body, an attractive mother who produced an unattractive daughter, and a family that neglects her. These observations about Meg's suffering don't disprove God's existence. They describe Meg's suffering, which she already knew about, and frame it as evidence against divine love. But suffering has never been incompatible with religious belief. Entire theological traditions exist to explain why good people experience pain. Brian doesn't defeat Meg's faith with logic. He defeats it by making her feel bad about herself, which works. Because making Meg feel bad about herself always works. Her moment of genuine spiritual connection gets crushed under the same psychological abuse that characterizes every interaction she has with her family. The book burning scene reveals how quickly Meg's perception got corrupted by human institutional religion. She starts with genuine spiritual experience, falls in with a church community that validates her, and within days, she's throwing books into a fire while claiming to do God's will. The trajectory mirrors countless historical examples of authentic mystics whose visions got co-opted by organized religion and turned toward destructive ends. Meg saw something real. The church told her what it meant. The interpretation was wrong, but the original experience might have been legitimate. Brian pulls her back from book burning by insulting her appearance, which saves the books, but also destroys whatever authentic connection Meg had established. She doesn't leave religion because she realizes the divine doesn't exist. She leaves because Brian reminded her that she's ugly and unloved, and apparently, that trumps transcendent experience. 23 seasons of Meg's suffering make more sense if she carries awareness that her family lacks. She sees the cruelty clearly, feels the neglect viscerally, understands that something is fundamentally wrong with how her household operates. Everyone else normalizes the abuse because everyone else lacks the perception to recognize it as abuse. Meg's brief religious phase represented the one time she found a framework that explained her suffering and offered hope for transcendence. Brian took that away with a few well-placed insults about her body, and Meg returned to baseline misery with one more failed attempt at meaning added to her permanent record. The girl who saw God went back to being the girl nobody sees at all, carrying knowledge of the divine in a family that treats her like furniture and a town that treats her worse. Before we continue the video, if you're enjoying the video so far, subscribing really helps the channel grow. It's totally free. Now let's jump back in. Next up, the next season, and things take a turn you won't see coming. Season 8, Brian and Stewie hop between infinite parallel universes using a remote control device, visiting worlds where Christianity never existed, where dogs rule humans, where everything looks like a Disney cartoon, and where the Cuban Missile Crisis ended civilization. They press buttons, reality shifts. They press more buttons, reality shifts again. The episode treats multiverse travel like channel surfing, casual and consequence-free. Two friends on a road trip through existence itself. They eventually return home, confirm they're in the right universe by watching Meg fart and Chris laugh, and move on with their lives. Except the episode establishes that multiverse travel is imprecise, that the device had a shuffle button activated the entire time, causing random jumps, and that alternate versions of characters can cross between realities. Human Brian from the dog-ruled universe tries to come back with them, and immediately gets hit by a car. The show plays this for a dark punchline and never addresses the implications. If one alternate being can cross over, others can too. And if Brian and Stewie spent an entire episode bouncing randomly between realities without full control of their navigation, the odds of a clean return to their exact original universe approach zero. The theory proposes that Brian and Stewie didn't actually make it home. They landed in a universe close enough to pass casual inspection, where Meg still farts and Chris still laughs, but the family members they return to are variants rather than originals. Alternatively, they did reach their home universe but brought contamination with them, subtle reality bleeds that have been swapping family members with alternate versions ever since. Every time a character's personality shifts inexplicably between episodes, every time someone forgets a major life event that definitely happened, every time backstories contradict each other, that's evidence of multiverse replacement. The Griffins aren't bad at continuity. The Griffins keep getting switched out for slightly different versions of themselves, and nobody notices because the differences are small enough to dismiss as memory lapses or character growth. The episode confirms that functionally identical versions of every character exist across infinite realities. Disney Peter sings about pie with the same basic Peter personality filtered through animation style. Dog Universe Peter lives in the same house with the same family structure, just with species roles reversed. Low-resolution blocky Peter still married Lois and still asks about supper in the same cadence as regular Peter. The multiverse contains infinite Peters who are almost identical, distinguished only by minor variations in history or circumstance. If Brian and Stewie's device can access all these universes, and the device spent most of the episode on shuffle mode jumping randomly, then every button press carried a chance of depositing them in a universe 1 degree removed from their own. A universe where Peter said something slightly different at breakfast 12 years ago. A universe where Meg got a different haircut in middle school. A universe where everything looks the same but isn't. The shuffle revelation comes from alternate universe Stewie, a dog world version who figured out precise multiverse navigation while our Stewie was bouncing around randomly. This other Stewie offers to send them home, but he's sending them to the universe he identifies as their origin point based on his own calculations. Our Stewie and Brian have no way to verify accuracy. They trust a stranger from a reality where humans are pets, accept his coordinates, and land somewhere that looks right. The fart and laugh test they use to confirm arrival proves nothing except that this universe contains a Meg who farts and a Chris who laughs, which describes infinite parallel realities. They declared victory based on evidence that couldn't possibly distinguish their home from countless near-identical alternatives. Character inconsistencies throughout the series support the replacement theory with uncomfortable precision. Brian's political positions swing wildly between episodes, sometimes liberal crusader, sometimes hypocritical moderate, sometimes positions he explicitly rejected seasons earlier. Peter's intelligence fluctuates beyond what his established brain condition could explain, demonstrating competencies in some episodes that he lacks completely in others. Lois alternates between patient saint and selfish schemer with no clear trigger for the shifts. Stewie's entire personality transformed from homicidal easy genius to flamboyant sidekick across the series, a change so dramatic that the show itself has lampshaded it without explanation. Each inconsistency could represent a different variant occupying the character's slot. swapped in through multiverse bleed that nobody detects because nobody's looking for it. The episode establishes that crossing between universes is survivable, and that beings from other realities can exist in foreign dimensions without immediate consequences. Human Brian walks around Quahog, interacts with objects, breathes the air, and only dies because a car hit him rather than because reality rejected his presence. The multiverse doesn't enforce borders. Variants can slip through, survive indefinitely, and integrate into societies that assume they belong. If Human Brian could pass for native until his death, alternate Griffins could pass for their counterparts indefinitely. The family might contain members from 3 or 4 different realities at this point, each believing they're the original, each carrying memories that don't quite match because their histories diverged in ways too subtle to notice. The device itself remains in Stewie's possession after the episode, theoretically capable of causing more contamination every time he uses it. Future multiverse episodes show continued travel, continued exposure to alternate realities, continued opportunities for swaps and bleeds. Each trip increases the probability that something came back that shouldn't have, or that something left that can't return. The Griffins we watch in Season 23 might share nothing with the Griffins from Season 1 except superficial appearance and general role. The originals could be scattered across the multiverse, living lives in wrong realities, while replacements occupy their spots in a Quahog that stopped being the real Quahog the moment Stewie invented interdimensional travel and started pressing buttons without understanding the consequences. With that done, let's move on to the next season. This one hits different. Season 9. James Woods gets stabbed to death at his own dinner party in And Then There Were Fewer, a murder mystery episode where Diane Simmons systematically eliminates guests at a mansion gathering. The real killer turns out to be Diane, who orchestrated the entire event to frame Tom Tucker and eliminate James Woods for dumping her after she turned 40. Woods dies on screen, knife in chest. No ambiguity about his fate. The episode treats this as permanent, a genuine consequence in a show that rarely allows them. Except James Woods appears again in later seasons, alive and causing trouble for the Griffins, with no explanation for his resurrection and behavior patterns that diverge significantly from his pre-death characterization. The government double theory resolves this contradiction by proposing that the real James Woods died at Rocky Point Manor and stayed dead. Every subsequent appearance features an operative using Woods' identity for purposes that serve intelligence community interests rather than the original person's goals. The show presents this as cartoon logic, characters returning from death because the writers want to use them again, but the in-universe implications suggest something more coordinated. Someone needed James Woods to continue existing as a public figure, and they had the resources to make that happen, despite his very public murder at a party attended by dozens of Quahog residents who witnessed the body. The original James Woods had specific grievances against the Griffin family stemming from the identity theft incident where Peter stole his wallet and lived as James Woods for an extended period. His vendetta made sense, given the personal violation he experienced. Post-resurrection, James Woods demonstrates different obsessions, appearing in contexts that serve narrative convenience rather than logical character motivation. The erratic quality of his later appearances tracks with an operative who received incomplete briefing materials about the person he's impersonating. He knows the broad strokes of James Woods' history, but misses the emotional specificity that would inform authentic behavior. Diane Simmons' murder plot reveals how deeply compromised Quahog's power structures already were before the dinner party. She manipulated a young intern named Priscilla into seducing James Woods, convincing him to become a born-again Christian, and engineering the entire gathering that brought his victims together under one roof. One local news anchor accomplished all of this through manipulation and planning, demonstrating that Quahog's residents are exceptionally vulnerable to social engineering. If Diane could orchestrate an elaborate murder conspiracy with an intern and some carefully worded suggestions, imagine what an actual intelligence agency could accomplish with real resources. Replacing a dead celebrity with a trained double would barely register as a challenge for organizations that manipulate governments. The episode establishes that James Woods collected enemies throughout his career, wronging enough people that he compiled a written list of amends to make before his death. His misdeeds included punching Bonnie in the throat, ruining Tom Tucker's acting career, getting Seamus's limbs eaten during an acid trip, stealing Quagmire's girlfriend, and blackmailing Muriel Goldman into selling him OxyContin for his teenage girlfriend. This man had enough enemies to fill a mansion, and enough secrets to destroy multiple lives. An intelligence agency monitoring Quahog would have identified James Woods as a liability, someone whose continued existence created unpredictable security risks. Diane solved their problem for them, and they simply needed to install a replacement to maintain the illusion of continuity. The murder itself provides cover for the switch. Witnesses saw James Woods die, attended what they believed was the resolution of the case, and moved on with their lives. When James Woods reappears, the cognitive dissonance resolves itself through cartoon logic rather than investigation. Nobody questions how he survived a knife wound, because nobody in Quahog questions anything. The same population that accepts talking babies and dogs, monthly catastrophic property damage, and time travel as normal occurrences would easily accept a celebrity's return from the dead as just another weird thing that happened. The double walks into town, claims to be James Woods, and everyone shrugs because stranger things happen before breakfast in Quahog. Post-death James Woods' appearances lack the personal investment that characterized his original vendetta. The man who obsessively tormented the Griffins for stealing his identity had genuine emotional stakes in the conflict. Later versions seemed to antagonize them out of obligation rather than passion, hitting the expected story beats without the authentic rage that made original James Woods compelling as a recurring villain. An operative following a behavioral profile would produce exactly this kind of performance, technically accurate but emotionally hollow, missing the lived experience that informed the original person's choices. He knows he's supposed to hate Peter Griffin, but can't quite remember why it mattered so much. The intelligence community's interest in maintaining the James Woods identity connects to his career as a public figure with access to Hollywood power structures. The real James Woods attended industry events, knew celebrities, and moved through circles that intelligence agencies have historically monitored and infiltrated. His death created a vacancy that someone needed to fill, a trusted face that could continue attending parties, collecting information, and serving as an asset in environments where an unknown operative couldn't gain access. The Quahog connection provides cover for occasional erratic behavior. Anyone who seems strange can blame it on spending time in that weird Rhode Island town where nothing makes sense and nobody remembers yesterday. Now it's time for the next season, and honestly, this is where it gets insane. Season 10. In Back to the Pilot, Brian and Stewie travel back to January 31st, 1999, the exact date the pilot episode aired, so Brian can find a tennis ball he buried in the backyard. Simple enough mission, except Brian can't resist telling his past self about 9/11, which creates a timeline where he becomes a national hero for preventing the attacks. This cascades into George W. Bush losing the 2004 election without terrorism to exploit, the southern states seceding to form a new confederacy, and eventually nuclear war that kills 17 million people along the eastern seaboard. Brian and Stewie attempt to fix their mistake by traveling back again to stop themselves from interfering, but this creates duplicate versions of themselves, which creates more duplicates, until dozens of Brians and Stewies from various futures crowd into the Griffin living room, arguing about which intervention caused which catastrophe. They eventually vote on whether to prevent 9/11. The Yes 9/11 side wins 57-42, and everyone returns to their respective timelines. The episode ends with Brian and Stewie believing they've restored everything to normal, sitting on the couch with no memory of what they apparently did. The corrupted timeline theory proposes that the restoration failed. The vote happened, everyone dispersed, and Brian and Stewie returned to a present that seems correct, but carries permanent damage from the temporal interference. The show itself provides evidence for this interpretation during the time travel sequence. When Brian and Stewie visit the pilot, they notice the animation looks different. The characters stand frozen while setting up cutaway gags. Peter's eye does that weird creepy thing where it went over his nose, and past Stewie carries a thesaurus worth of vocabulary that present Stewie has apparently lost. These observations get played as meta-commentary about how the show has evolved, but within the episode's logic, Brian and Stewie are literally watching a different version of reality. The pilot they visit doesn't match their memories because their memories formed in a timeline that no longer exists. The episode establishes that time travel creates branching realities rather than clean loops. Each intervention spawns a new timeline with its own versions of Brian and Stewie, who then travel back and create more branches. The voting scene features an odd number of total participants, despite only pairs traveling together, which Stewie notes with confusion before dismissing it. One of the Brians arrived with his throat slit, dead on arrival, which should have killed all subsequent Brians but didn't for reasons nobody can explain. The rules of time travel in this episode contradict themselves multiple times, suggesting the mechanism itself has become corrupted through overuse. If the time machine can't maintain consistent logic within a single episode, the idea that it perfectly restored the original timeline strains credulity. Character personalities shifted noticeably around this point in the series, changes that fans attribute to flanderization, but that the corrupted timeline theory explains as literal replacement. The Brian who returns from back to the pilot might not be the same Brian who left. Stewie's evil genius tendencies had already been fading, but they accelerate after this episode in ways that suggest the Stewie who came back prioritizes different things than the Stewie who originally built the time machine. Peter's intelligence fluctuations become more extreme. Meg's treatment by the family intensifies. These shifts happen gradually across multiple seasons, but the timeline corruption theory suggests they represent accumulated damage from a reality that keeps trying to reconcile contradictory versions of itself. The episode's visit to 5 years in the future shows a version of the Griffin family that has become lazy, relying on minimal effort setups and acknowledging the structure of their own jokes with exhausted self-awareness. Peter finds double-sided tape and announces he can do about 7 minutes worth of funny stuff with it to fill time before the next story beat. Chris receives a bad grade, and Lois responds by announcing, "Here's a cutaway," before declaring that Matthew McConaughey is terrible. The characters have become aware of their own formula and stopped caring about execution. This future gets erased by subsequent time travel, but the meta-awareness it demonstrated has bled into the restored timeline in subtler forms. Characters reference past events with inconsistent details. Storylines contradict established canon. The show itself seems uncertain about its own history. The animation quality shift that Brian and Stewie notice when visiting the pilot represents more than technical evolution. The pilot exists in a different reality with different visual rules, and traveling between them damages both. Every return trip deposits Brian and Stewie in a timeline that approximates their original, but can't perfectly replicate it, because perfect replication would require information that got lost during the branching process. The show after Back to the Pilot looks cleaner and moves smoother than the show before, which production would explain as improved technology and bigger budgets. The theory explains it as reality itself being redrawn by whatever force reconciles timeline conflicts, smoothing over contradictions by imposing visual consistency that masks the underlying discontinuity. Stewie's final solution involves traveling back to the moment just before their original arrival and threatening their past selves into leaving without doing anything. He tells Brian that if successful, "You and I will never have existed. The chronological tangent that created us will have been erased." They feel a brief pain, Brian's leg hurts, and then they're sitting on the couch with no memory of the adventure. This resolution assumes the erasure worked cleanly, but Stewie explicitly describes them as existing on a chronological tangent that would be eliminated. The Brian and Stewie who remember nothing aren't the same Brian and Stewie who went on the adventure. They're replacements generated by the restored timeline, carrying memories that don't include the trip because the trip never happened in their version of events. The originals got erased. The show continues with copies who don't know they're copies, living in a timeline that doesn't know it's corrupted, watching a past that never quite matches what anyone remembers, because nobody remembers the same past anymore. Let's roll into the next season, because this one rewrites everything. Season 11. In Into Fat Air, the Griffin family climbs Mount Everest to prove they're just as good as Ross and Pam Fishman, an insufferably smug couple who talk down to them at a dinner party. The Griffins reach the summit, get caught in a massive storm on the descent, run out of food, find the Fishman's dead son Ben frozen in the snow, eat his corpse to survive, then rescue Ross and Pam from a crevasse before casually confessing to the cannibalism as the episode ends. Peter carries 2 adults up an ice wall while exhausted and malnourished. The family survives exposure that killed an experienced climber. Everyone makes it home despite conditions that should have been fatal multiple times over. The episode plays this as a heartwarming story about family unity and doing the right thing, with a dark comedy twist about eating a teenager. The theory proposes that the Griffins didn't survive the storm. They died somewhere on that mountain, frozen and buried under snow like Ben Fishman, and everything we've watched since season 11 represents their collective afterlife experience. The increasingly absurd storylines, the complete absence of permanent consequences, the characters' inability to learn or grow despite constant catastrophic experiences, all of it makes sense if you accept that we're watching dead people who don't know they're dead, living out an eternity that feels like episodic television because that's the framework their American brains understood best. The climb itself establishes that the Griffins had no business being on Everest. Peter falls into a crevasse early in the attempt and survives only because a pile of dead bodies cushioned his landing. The family runs out of food because Peter thought trail mix meant a playlist of jock jam songs. They have no real mountaineering experience, inadequate supplies, and a GPS device that immediately has an emotional breakdown when asked basic questions. These people were going to die. The question was when, and the storm that catches them on the descent provides the obvious answer. Meg screams that she can't see. Chris has altitude sickness. Everyone is freezing and starving, and somehow they all walk out alive. The survival strains credibility even by cartoon standards. The cannibalism scene deserves close examination because it represents the moral event horizon that makes afterlife more plausible than continued life. The Griffins find Ben Fishman's frozen corpse and eat him without significant hesitation. Brian suggests it, everyone agrees within seconds, and Peter produces a knife and fork from his backpack as if he'd been waiting for exactly this situation. They consume a human being they knew personally, the son of the family they were competing against, and show no meaningful psychological consequences afterward. When Ross and Pam mention they're looking for Ben, Peter jokes that, "My gut tells me he'll be squeezing himself out of a crevice very soon." The family who just ate a child treats it as dinner conversation. Either the Griffins are genuine psychopaths who should be institutionalized, or they're already dead and operating under afterlife rules where morality becomes negotiable. The rescue sequence at the episode's end defies physics in ways that suggest reality has stopped applying. Peter, exhausted and malnourished after days of climbing and one meal of human flesh, carries two unconscious adults up an ice wall using a rope held by his equally exhausted family. The combined weight should have pulled everyone into the crevasse. The physical effort should have caused cardiac failure in a man who gets winded walking to the refrigerator. Instead, Peter muscles through on pure determination, and everyone survives to exchange pleasantries at base camp. This works in an afterlife where willpower shapes reality. It doesn't work on a physical mountain governed by gravity and biology. Post-season 11 Family Guy features storylines of escalating absurdity that make more sense as afterlife fantasies than earthly experiences. Peter gets superpowers, fights celebrities, travels through time repeatedly, and survives injuries that would kill anyone alive. The family's circumstances reset completely between episodes, regardless of what happened previously. Characters who die return without explanation. Quahog itself seems to exist in a bubble where national and world events barely register unless the plot requires acknowledgement. The town operates like a closed system, a self-contained reality that provides whatever the residents need without logical connection to the outside world. This describes purgatory more accurately than it describes Rhode Island. The theory explains why the Griffins can never escape their circumstances or achieve genuine growth. Peter remains employed at the brewery despite constant incompetence because the afterlife provides structure without requiring performance. Meg continues suffering abuse because her psychological expectation of suffering shapes her eternal experience. Chris stays 13 forever because his conception of himself froze at the moment of death. Stewie builds incredible technology that never changes anything because accomplishment in the afterlife produces only the feeling of accomplishment, never actual progress. Brian drinks himself toward oblivion, seeking meaning that doesn't exist because meaning requires mortality, and mortality is exactly what the Griffins lost on that mountain. The final scene shows Peter blurting out, "We ate your son," to Ross and Pam, as if confessing a minor social faux pas. The Fishmans' reaction gets cut off by the episode ending, leaving their response to learning about their child's consumption permanently ambiguous. In life, this confession would trigger police involvement, psychological intervention, and the complete destruction of the Griffin family's social standing. In the afterlife, it becomes another reset button moment, a dark punchline that everyone will forget by next week, because next week is the same week as every week when you're dead and running on eternal return. The Griffins ate Ben Fishman on Mount Everest, and then they died, and now they live forever in a Rhode Island that exists only in their collective imagination, watching themselves do the same things over and over while the snow buries their actual bodies somewhere above the clouds. Moving on to the next season, and this is where the show completely changes. Season 12. In Quagmire's Mom, Glenn Quagmire faces 20 years in prison for statutory rape after sleeping with a high school girl he met at Peter's party. The episode treats this as a legal inconvenience rather than a moral crisis, with the gang joking about the situation while Quagmire prepares for incarceration. Then, his mother Crystal shows up at the courthouse, initially presenting herself as a born-again Christian seeking to rehabilitate her son through faith. The judge denies her request and sentences Quagmire to prison anyway. As Quagmire boards the transport van, his mother reappears with the judge, announcing that new DNA evidence has been produced, and the sentence is commuted. The implication lands with uncomfortable clarity. Crystal Quagmire slept with the judge to free her son, abandoning her religious conversion the moment sexual manipulation became useful. The episode ends with Brian observing, Quagmire got away with it and learned nothing, which the show frames as a happy ending. The theory proposes that Quagmire's entire personality, his compulsive sexuality, his catchphrases, his inability to form meaningful relationships, represents trauma response rather than character quirk. Crystal Quagmire actively programmed him through childhood exposure to her own sexual behavior, creating a psychological framework where intimacy equals transaction and women exist primarily as conquests. The Giggity persona functions as dissociation, a performance that protects Glenn from confronting what was done to him by reducing all sexual encounters to comedy rather than connection. Quagmire's courtroom testimony provides explicit confirmation of this programming. He describes being born 9 times in one day because his mother kept asking the doctor to put him back so she could push him out again, aroused by the physical sensation of childbirth. He learned the alphabet through the names of his mother's sexual partners: Art, Bob, Chet, Don, Ed, Frank, Gus, Hal, Irv, John, Ken, Lou, Matt, Ned, Ox, Pat, Quint, Ron, Sam, Tom, Ulf, Vic, Walter, Xavier, Yaz, and Zeke, with the song ending by noting, "Those are just some of the guys. There are lots of other guys." His mother attended his high school prom as someone's date rather than as a chaperone. The childhood Quagmire describes involves constant exposure to adult sexuality without boundaries, protection, or age-appropriate development. The psychological literature on children raised by sexually inappropriate parents describes exactly the patterns Quagmire displays. Hypersexuality as an adult frequently traces back to premature sexualization in childhood, where the developing brain learns to associate intimacy with chaos, unpredictability, and performance, rather than genuine connection. Quagmire's inability to maintain relationships, his compulsive pursuit of sexual novelty, his reduction of women to conquest rather than partnership, all of these symptoms appear in survivors of environments like the one he describes. The show plays his behavior for laughs, but the backstory Crystal provides transforms every giggity into evidence of developmental damage. Crystal's courtroom behavior demonstrates the manipulation tactics Quagmire grew up observing. She arrives claiming religious conversion, performing righteousness while carrying 3 handguns that the metal detectors somehow missed. When Faith fails to free her son, she immediately pivots to sexual manipulation of the judge, producing an impressive amount of DNA evidence, according to her own assessment. The judge's fly is down when he announces the commuted sentence. Crystal moves seamlessly between personas, born-again Christian and sexual operator, deploying whichever identity serves her immediate goals. Quagmire learned to navigate the world by watching this woman, and he adopted her toolkit without understanding that the toolkit itself was the problem. The episode frames Crystal's intervention as maternal love finally manifesting, a touching moment where mother and son reconcile after years of estrangement. Quagmire accepts this interpretation, thanking his mother and expressing desire for a second chance at their relationship. The framing ignores that Crystal just committed what amounts to sexual bribery of a federal official, used the same manipulative sexuality that damaged her son to extract him from consequences, and demonstrated that her conversion was performance rather than transformation. She didn't save Quagmire. She reinforced every lesson his childhood taught him, that sex solves problems, that women's bodies are currency, that consequences can be escaped through strategic intimacy. Quagmire's statutory rape charge itself reflects the programming his mother installed. He genuinely didn't know the girl was underage, but his inability to read appropriate social cues about potential partners stems from never learning what appropriate looks like. Crystal's partners during his childhood apparently included high school students, given that she attended his prom as a date. Glenn grew up in an environment where age gaps, power differentials, and consent boundaries simply didn't register as important considerations. He pursued the high schooler at Peter's party, using the same approach that worked on every other woman, because he lacks the internal framework to distinguish between situations where that approach is acceptable and situations where it constitutes a crime. The giggity catchphrase deserves examination as a dissociative mechanism. Quagmire deploys it reflexively at any mention of sexuality, converting potentially meaningful moments into comedy bits that require no emotional engagement. The catchphrase creates distance between Glenn and his actions, transforming him from a person making choices into a character performing a role. Dissociation commonly develops in children who experience overwhelming situations they cannot process or escape. Little Glenn, watching his mother cycle through partners, learning to associate love with promiscuity, developed Quagmire as a protective identity that could survive what Glenn could not. The man we see in every episode represents armor rather than authentic self. Trauma response calcified into personality, a coping mechanism so complete that the person underneath may no longer exist in any recoverable form. And real quick, if this has been interesting so far, feel free to subscribe. It's free and it helps us keep improving these videos. Alright, moving on. Now on to the next season. You're not ready for this one. Season 13. In Stewie is Enceinte, Stewie Griffin builds a fertilization device, extracts Brian's DNA from hair and saliva, impregnates himself with a temporary uterus, and gives birth to 7 hybrid puppies that emerge from multiple orifices simultaneously. The episode treats this as relationship comedy, Stewie wanting to reconnect with a distant Brian through parenthood, but the biological implications get brushed aside for jokes about pregnancy cravings and baby showers. Cross-species reproduction between a human and a dog should be genetically impossible. The chromosomal incompatibility alone would prevent fertilization, let alone viable offspring. Yet Stewie's body accepts Brian's canine DNA, gestates hybrid creatures, and delivers them successfully without medical intervention beyond Dr. Hartman's cursory examination. Either the fertilization device performed miracles of genetic engineering in a basement laboratory, or Stewie's DNA was already unusual enough to accommodate cross-species hybridization. The theory proposes that Stewie Griffin contains non-human genetic material, possibly alien or artificially engineered, which explains both his extraordinary intelligence and his body's apparent compatibility with canine DNA. His football-shaped head, present since birth, represents a physical marker of genetic deviation that his family has normalized through exposure. His genius-level intellect, his ability to construct time machines and teleportation devices and mind control rays, his capacity for speech and philosophical reasoning as an infant, none of these characteristics appear in any other human child in the Family Guy universe. Stewie operates on a different biological and cognitive level than everyone around him, and cross-species pregnancy provides the clearest evidence yet that his genome contains something fundamentally non-human. Dr. Hartman's examination scene inadvertently confirms the abnormality of Stewie's biology. When the doctor notes that his patient's vagina seems to have a penis and 2 testicles, Stewie dismisses it by claiming he sneezed real hard and all that came out. Hartman accepts this explanation without question, demonstrating either profound medical incompetence or conditioning to ignore anomalies in Stewie's physiology. The temporary uterus Stewie created apparently integrated with his male anatomy seamlessly enough to support pregnancy, a biological impossibility for any normal human, regardless of the technology involved. His body adapted to reproductive requirements it was never designed to handle, suggesting his cellular structure possesses flexibility that standard human genetics cannot provide. The offspring themselves provide evidence of Stewie's genetic strangeness. 7 puppies emerge displaying various combinations of human and canine characteristics, some with dog heads and human ears, some apparently blind, some deaf, some with loose bones, and some attractive enough to warrant separation from the others. This variety suggests unstable hybridization, where Stewie's genetic contribution interacted unpredictably with Brian's, producing creatures that express different trait combinations depending on which genes dominated during development. Normal human DNA would simply reject canine chromosomes during fertilization. Stewie's DNA apparently negotiated with them, combining in ways that produced viable, if varied, offspring. The head shape deserves dedicated examination as potential evidence of non-human origin. Stewie's skull resembles an American football, elongated and pointed in ways that no human cranial structure naturally develops. The family treats this as normal, never questioning why their infant looks fundamentally different from every other baby they encounter. Lois mentions in the pilot that the doctor called Stewie the happiest-looking baby he'd ever seen, suggesting the medical establishment noticed something unusual, but framed it positively rather than investigating. Cranial elongation in human populations typically indicates either artificial binding practices or genetic conditions that cause developmental abnormalities. Stewie demonstrates no cognitive impairment, ruling out most pathological explanations and leaving either deliberate engineering or non-terrestrial genetics as remaining possibilities. His technological capabilities support the engineered origin theory. Stewie builds devices that exceed anything available to human science, creating functional time machines before his 2nd birthday. The knowledge required for such construction doesn't exist in any accessible form. He didn't learn temporal mechanics from books or the internet. He apparently possesses intuitive understanding of physics and engineering principles that human scientists haven't discovered yet. This suggests either inherited knowledge encoded genetically, access to information sources unknown to other characters, or cognitive architecture designed specifically for advanced technological development. An artificially enhanced human or alien hybrid would have exactly these characteristics: intelligence that exceeds species norms, intuitive grasp of principles beyond current understanding, and physical markers distinguishing them from baseline humans. The pregnancy storyline's resolution raises additional questions about Stewie's nature. He and Brian decide to abandon the puppies, dropping them off somewhere unnamed with confidence they'll be adopted. Neither parent demonstrates sustained emotional attachment to offspring they created together, a response that makes more sense if Stewie's emotional architecture differs from human norms. His desire for a baby stemmed from strategic calculation about improving his relationship with Brian rather than genuine parental instinct. When that strategy proved unnecessary, he discarded the children without apparent guilt or grief. This emotional detachment could indicate alien psychology, artificial personality construction, or simply the sociopathy that Stewie has demonstrated throughout the series. Combined with the genetic evidence, the pattern suggests a being designed for intelligence and capability at the expense of standard human emotional responses. The show has never explained where Stewie's abilities come from. His siblings are unremarkable. His parents demonstrate no unusual characteristics. His extended family includes normal humans on both sides. Stewie alone possesses genius, ambition, and physical abnormalities that set him apart from every blood relative. Something happened during his conception, gestation, or early development that made him fundamentally different from the human child Lois thought she was carrying. The pregnancy with Brian's puppies confirms that difference isn't merely psychological. Stewie's body operates according to rules that don't apply to other humans, accepting foreign DNA and producing hybrid offspring because his genetic structure was never purely human in the first place. Let's move to the next season. This is the moment everything shifts. Season 14. In The Peanut Butter Kid, Stewie accidentally books a peanut butter commercial by being adorable at a mall audition, launching a child acting career that quickly spirals into exploitation. Peter and Lois become stage parents overnight, keeping Stewie awake until 3 a.m. to rehearse, drugging him with a homemade concoction of 5-hour energy, espresso, and a tiny super small amount of cocaine, and threatening to kill his toys if he fails auditions. The episode ends with Stewie deliberately sabotaging a commercial shoot to escape the industry, groping an actress, and attempting to defecate on set while screaming profanity. Brian orchestrated this meltdown after showing Stewie a presentation about child actors who ended up doing porn, becoming drug addicts, or dying young. The family learns their lesson. Stewie returns to normal baby life, and a creepy man winks at him in the final scene before Peter calls him out as a creep. Roll credits, everything's fine, except nothing about that ending suggests everything is fine. The theory proposes that Stewie's brief Hollywood career exposed him to the predatory systems that have destroyed countless child actors, and his rapid exit came from discovering something the episode could only hint at through coded references and uncomfortable imagery. The winking man in the final scene represents the threat that Stewie narrowly escaped, a visual acknowledgement that the danger wasn't just stage parents and sleep deprivation. The entertainment industry's history of child exploitation runs deep enough that a primetime animated comedy couldn't directly address it, so the show embedded warnings throughout the episode that attentive viewers would recognize while maintaining plausible deniability as a simple cautionary tale about pushy parents. Brian's intervention speech names specific victims of the child star system: the kid from A Christmas Story who did porn, Boner from Growing Pains who died, Screech who did porn, Corey Haim who died, Dana Plato who did porn, then dead. He then mentions Bryan Singer by name as an example of perverted Hollywood directors, a reference that carries significantly more weight given subsequent allegations against the filmmaker. The show aired this episode in January 2016, years before Singer's most public accusations, but well after industry insiders had circulated rumors about his behavior. Brian's casual name drop suggests the writers knew exactly what they were referencing and chose to include it anyway, hiding a genuine warning inside a comedy bit about washed-up child actors. The audition scenes depict a competitive environment where mothers brag about their children's proximity to trauma and exploitation. One mom boasts that her son had a gun waved in his face in a Dexter episode. Another announces her daughter is the American Apparel slut baby. A third proudly declares her son got crapped on in the last Jackass movie. These mothers treat exposure to violence, sexualization, and degradation as career accomplishments rather than red flags. The show presents this as dark comedy, but the underlying message describes an industry where parents actively seek out opportunities for their children to be harmed, because harm translates to visibility, and visibility translates to bookings. Peter's coaching advice to Stewie before the second audition carries disturbing implications. You go in that room and imagine everyone in it wants you sexually. I'm doing it right now, and I feel powerful. The joke lands because Peter is an idiot giving inappropriate advice, but the underlying concept describes exactly how predators groom child performers. Teaching children to interpret adult attention as sexual desire, framing that interpretation as empowering rather than threatening, normalizes the kind of boundary violations that enable exploitation. Peter doesn't understand what he's saying, but someone wrote that line knowing exactly what it referenced. Stewie's drug regimen throughout the episode mirrors documented practices in child entertainment. Parents and handlers have historically used stimulants to keep young performers alert during long shooting days, sedatives to help them sleep on command, and various substances to manage weight and energy levels. Peter's 8-hour energy concoction, played for laughs, describes actual abuse that child actors have reported experiencing. The show acknowledges this happened to Stewie, shows him deteriorating physically and psychologically, and frames his escape as a happy ending without addressing the permanent damage such treatment causes. The comedy format allows the episode to depict child drugging without lingering on its horror. The final scene's winking man appears without explanation, receives no follow-up, and exists solely to create discomfort. Peter calls him a creep and expresses hope to never see that happen again, but the man faces no consequences and presumably continues operating in whatever capacity brought him into contact with the Griffin family. His inclusion serves no narrative purpose except to remind viewers that the danger Stewie escaped remains present for other children. The episode's resolution doesn't eliminate the threat. It just moves Stewie out of the threat's immediate path while leaving the system intact. Stewie's chosen method of career destruction involves sexual aggression and public defecation, behaviors that read as deliberate scandal creation designed to make him unemployable. Child actors who want out of the industry rarely have the option of simply quitting. Contracts, financial dependencies, and parental pressure keep them working against their will. The most reliable exit strategy involves becoming so toxic that no one will hire you, which often means public meltdowns, substance abuse, or erratic behavior that gets you labeled as difficult. Stewie, being Stewie, engineers exactly this outcome in a single afternoon, groping an actress, screaming obscenities, and attempting to defecate on camera. He performs the self-destruction that takes other child actors years to achieve, compressing an entire career's worth of industry damage into one spectacular flameout. The episode's title references Peanut Butter Kid, but Stewie's actual peanut butter commercial occupies maybe 2 minutes of screen time. The rest of the episode depicts the machinery that surrounds child performers: competitive parents, demanding auditions, sleep deprivation, drug use, and the ever-present threat of predatory adults who see children as resources rather than people. The peanut butter commercial itself is innocent. Everything around it is corrupt. Stewie escaped because he's a genius with a supportive, if criminally negligent friend who recognized the danger. The other children in those waiting rooms, with their bragging mothers and their traumatic credits, remain inside the system with no one looking out for them. Heading into the next season, and it's nothing like the last one. Season 15. In The Boys in the Band, Stewie and Brian form a children's music duo called Red Shirt, Blue Shirt, book their first gig at a birthday party, become local sensations, develop creative differences, break up, reconcile, and watch their replacement act take over, all within what appears to be a single week of story time. The band's trajectory from mall flyer to packed venues to dramatic dissolution compresses an entire VH1 behind the music arc into 22 minutes. No time passes for the rest of the family during this rise and fall. Peter's subplot about Chris working for Quagmire occupies the same temporal space without any indication that months or years elapsed. The episode treats fame as something that can be acquired, exploited, and discarded between commercial breaks, which either represents lazy storytelling or accurate documentation of how time actually functions in Quahog. The theory proposes that Quahog exists in a pocket dimension where temporal rules differ from the outside world. Time moves at whatever pace the narrative requires, expanding to accommodate decades of experience or compressing to allow overnight success. Characters never age because aging requires consistent time flow, and Quahog's dimension doesn't provide that. Meg has been in high school for over 20 years of broadcast time. Stewie remains perpetually 1 year old despite building time machines, learning multiple languages, and accumulating enough life experience to fill several adult lifetimes. The outside world barely acknowledges Quahog's existence because the outside world operates on normal temporal mechanics that can't interface properly with Quahog's variable timeline. The band's fame trajectory provides the clearest evidence of temporal manipulation in this episode. Stewie writes songs, Brian joins as partner, they perform at one birthday party, and suddenly they're playing venues with professional sound systems, merchandise, and a dedicated fan following. Olivia appears as president of their fan club, despite the club apparently forming between scenes. The audience at their shows grows from 6 children to packed rooms of adults and kids, without any montage or time-skip acknowledgement. Fame in Quahog accumulates through narrative convenience rather than realistic progression, because Quahog's dimension allocates time based on story requirements rather than physical laws. The episode's B-plot reinforces the temporal anomaly through Chris's employment arc. He gets hired by Quagmire, learns the job's disturbing requirements, becomes competent enough to record professional voicemail greetings, and gets fired by his mother in what appears to be the same week as Stewie's entire music career. Chris demonstrates no learning curve, no adjustment period, no gradual discovery of Quagmire's perversions. He simply possesses job competency the moment the plot requires it, then loses the job the moment the plot requires that. Time in Quahog serves narrative function rather than providing consistent backdrop for character development. Characters reference experiences that would require years to accumulate while demonstrating no evidence of aging or growth. Stewie mentions hitting rock bottom with Brian present, implying a history of struggles that the show has never depicted continuously. Brian's musical abilities appear fully formed, despite no prior establishment of instrumental skill. Olivia resurfaces from a previous episode where Stewie literally burned her alive in a cardboard house, yet she shows no trauma, no time having passed, no explanation for how she survived or what she's been doing since. Characters in Quahog carry histories that don't connect to any observable timeline, accumulating backstory through implication rather than depicted experience. The outside world's relationship to Quahog supports the pocket dimension theory. No national media covers Red Shirt Blue Shirt's meteoric rise despite their apparent local dominance. No record labels approach them. No touring opportunities emerge beyond Quahog's birthday party circuit. The band exists entirely within the town's boundaries, achieving fame that has no currency beyond the pocket dimension's borders. When characters do leave Quahog for adventures in other locations, those trips feel disconnected from any continuous timeline, vacation episodes that could slot anywhere in the series without contradiction because temporal position doesn't matter in a dimension where time itself is negotiable. Peter's introductory cutaway about the extended director's cut of Willy Wonka establishes the episode's thematic concern with manipulated time and narrative. The scene depicts Charlie refusing to return the everlasting gobstopper, while Wonka comments, hint hint, about earning happiness, a moment that in the original film represents Charlie's moral test, but here becomes dark comedy about adults pressuring children. The cutaway exists outside the episode's timeline entirely, neither before nor after the main plot, occupying narrative space without temporal position. Cutaways throughout Family Guy function this way, depicting events that may or may not have happened, may or may not occur in the future, existing in a suspended state that normal time doesn't permit. The band's dissolution and Olivia's takeover happen with the same temporal compression as everything else. Brian quits, Olivia replaces him, and the new configuration performs immediately at what appears to be the same venue where they just played together. No rehearsal period, no adjustment, no gap between lineup changes. Vinny the dog appears in the final scene as Olivia's new partner, performing a song about baked clams and other kid stuff, to a cheering crowd that accepted this substitution without any apparent transition period. Fame in Quahog transfers between performers instantly, because fame in Quahog isn't earned through time investment, it's allocated by whatever force controls the pocket dimension's narrative priorities. 23 seasons of evidence supports the temporal anomaly interpretation. Characters die and return. Injuries heal between scenes. Pregnancies complete in single episodes. Businesses open and close without economic reality. Elections happen. Positions change, and nobody tracks the passage of terms. Quahog operates on time that bends to accommodate story. And The Boys in the Band simply makes this manipulation more visible than usual by compressing an entire music career into a single episode without pretending that realistic time passed. The pocket dimension doesn't hide its nature. Viewers just learn to accept temporal inconsistency as cartoon logic rather than recognizing it as documentation of a place where time genuinely works differently than anywhere else in the observable universe. Time for the next season, and this one will mess with your expectations. Season 16. Send in Stewie, please. Stewie Griffin sits in a therapist's office for the entire episode. No cutaways, no B-plot, no family interruptions. Just one character talking to one other character for 22 minutes. The bottle episode format strips away every protective layer Family Guy normally provides, forcing Stewie to exist without the distractions that usually prevent examination of his psychological complexity. What emerges is a character who understands himself with terrifying clarity, who constructed an elaborate persona to survive an existence he finds unbearable, and who ultimately murders the only person who ever saw through the performance rather than allow that knowledge to exist in the world. The episode ends with Stewie asking Brian to sleep in his bed because he did something awful, a moment of vulnerability that acknowledges the horror of what just happened while refusing to process it. The theory proposes that Stewie's psychological depth in this episode proves he's aware of existing within a television show, and his entire life represents an attempt to escape or transcend the narrative constraints that trap him. His genius, his schemes, his elaborate persona, all of it functions as resistance against a reality he perceives as artificial. The therapy session works because Dr. Pritchfield exists outside the normal episode structure, appearing in a format that temporarily suspends Family Guy's usual rules. For once, Stewie can speak honestly because the narrative machinery that usually prevents character development has been disabled. The moment the session ends, he has to kill the therapist to prevent that honesty from contaminating the show's normal operation. Stewie's confession about his accent provides the episode's central revelation. He admits his British voice is nothing more than an affectation, a coat of armor to get me through the day, just an image I cultivated so I could feel special. When he drops the accent and speaks in what he claims is his real voice, an American accent, Dr. Pritchfield can't hear the difference. The therapist also can't hear the British accent everyone else notices. This disconnect suggests Stewie's persona operates on a level that only other show-aware characters can perceive. The accent isn't real within the show's diegetic reality. It's a performance for the audience that characters inside the narrative process differently than viewers outside it. The breakdown where Stewie realizes he doesn't want to be like everybody else crystallizes his existential horror. Dr. Pritchfield offers him normalcy, make friends, be yourself, connect with others. Stewie initially embraces this possibility before recoiling in terror at what it means. Being normal means being like his family, like Quahog's residents, like the background characters who exist without depth or agency. Stewie's genius and cruelty and elaborate schemes aren't personality traits. They're survival mechanisms that maintain his separation from a narrative that would otherwise flatten him into another recurring joke. His evil is actually rebellion against a universe that wants him to be simple. The murder of Dr. Pritchfield represents Stewie eliminating the only character who achieved genuine insight into his nature. The therapist saw through the performance, understood the loneliness underneath, and offered connection that Stewie desperately wanted but couldn't accept. Allowing Pritchfield to live would mean allowing that understanding to exist, which would mean Stewie's carefully constructed separation from the show's reality had been breached. He kills the therapist to preserve the illusion, to maintain his status as the only character who knows what's really happening. The murder isn't cruelty, it's information containment, eliminating a witness to truths that can't be allowed to spread. Stewie's performance of Hamilton lyrics during the session demonstrates his awareness of existing in entertainment. He references the show's lengthy Broadway run, complains that Quahog won't get touring productions for years, and laments having no one to appreciate his talents. These complaints only make sense from a character who understands theatrical performance, audience reception, and the cultural infrastructure that determines which stories reach which populations. Stewie wants the world to fall in love with me 8 times a week, a desire that explicitly frames existence in terms of performance schedules and audience relationships. He's describing wanting to be a successful show. The episode's lack of cutaway gags supports the meta-awareness interpretation. Cutaways represent Family Guy's signature narrative device, the mechanism that allows the show to comment on itself and reference external media. Their absence in Send in Stewie Please creates a space where the show's normal self-referential structure can't operate, which is exactly why Stewie can finally speak honestly. The cutaway format keeps characters fragmented, interrupting any moment that might develop into genuine depth. Without that interruption, Stewie accesses psychological complexity that the show's normal structure actively prevents. His awareness exists precisely because he's usually trapped in a format designed to prevent awareness. The final scene shows Stewie asking Brian to share his bed, admitting he did something awful, but refusing to discuss it. Brian agrees without pressing, demonstrating the intimacy they share that Stewie claimed to want but couldn't achieve with a therapist. The difference? Brian exists within the show's normal structure, operating under the same narrative constraints as Stewie, unable to perceive or threaten the truth about their existence. Stewie can be vulnerable with Brian because Brian's understanding can never reach the level Pritchfield achieved. The dog will forget by next episode. The therapist would have remembered forever, which is exactly why he had to die. Stewie's loneliness isn't about lacking connection. It's about being the only character conscious enough to understand that real connection is impossible within a reality that resets every week. Now entering the next season, and things go off the rails. Season 17. In You Can't Handle the Booth, the Griffin family sits in a recording studio providing DVD commentary for an episode of their own lives, watching themselves on screen while discussing behind-the-scenes details, personal grievances, and production trivia. The format breaks the fourth wall so completely that it shatters into fragments, with the characters simultaneously existing as people experiencing events and as performers discussing those events after the fact. Patrick, the booth operator, calls them to session. Danny, the intern, delivers paychecks. Shannon Smith, the animation producer, hovers awkwardly, hoping to contribute. The Griffins treat all of this as routine. Another day at work, another commentary track to record. No indication that watching your own existence on a monitor while discussing it with colleagues represents anything unusual. They argue about water bottles, complain about pizza instead of buffet lunch, and make snide comments about each other's behavior during scenes they apparently lived through but now observe from outside. The theory proposes that these commentary sessions aren't meta-comedy, but actual documentation requirements imposed by whatever entity monitors the Griffins' existence. The family has been studied for so long that they've normalized surveillance into their routine, showing up to recording booths on schedule, providing observations about their behavior, receiving payment for their participation. The DVD commentary framing gives the monitoring a consumer product justification that makes it feel voluntary rather than mandatory. But the infrastructure surrounding these sessions suggests institutional oversight. Booth operators, interns, producers, paychecks processed through corporate payroll systems that apparently answer to both Fox and Disney. Someone built this apparatus, someone maintains it, someone pays for the electricity and the pizza, and the water bottles that need Sharpie names. The Griffins just show up and talk, offering psychological data disguised as entertainment industry labor. The episode reveals information hierarchies that support the monitoring theory. Peter makes 4 times Lois's salary, a disparity she didn't know about until Danny delivered the wrong envelope. Peter was previously married to Sarah Paulson, information Lois never received despite decades of apparent partnership. Chris might be Philip Seymour Hoffman's biological son, rather than Peter's. These revelations emerge during the commentary session, as if the monitoring context creates pressure that forces disclosure. The Griffins learn things about each other they should have known for years, suggesting the commentary booth functions as something between therapy session and interrogation room, a space where truths surface that normal existence keeps buried. The monitoring catalyzes confession, creating conditions where secrets become unsustainable and family members reveal information they've hidden for entire lifetimes. Seth MacFarlane's appearance in the booth confirms the monitoring extends beyond the Griffin family to encompass the entire reality they inhabit. He announces that none of the characters are real, that they're voiced by actors, that their existence serves entertainment purposes for an audience they cannot perceive. The Griffins absorb this information with remarkable equanimity, accepting their ontological status as fictional constructs without existential crisis. Peter asks about fat nerds who impersonate him at conventions. Brian immediately tries to leverage the voice-sharing revelation for financial access. Meg processes her unreality by noting that her voice actor is attractive while she isn't. This acceptance only makes sense if they've been conditioned to receive such revelations, if the commentary sessions have gradually prepared them for the ultimate disclosure that their reality exists for observation rather than its own sake. They've been trained to metabolize existential horror as workplace conversation. The booth's physical infrastructure suggests permanent installation rather than temporary production setup. Patrick operates equipment from a control room with established protocols. Shannon knows the building well enough to fetch people from hallways and suggests recording additional content while MacFarlane is present. The Griffins have designated water bottles that Chris guards jealously, implying repeated sessions where personal items accumulate and territorial disputes develop. Stewie falls asleep during recording, comfortable enough in this environment to lose consciousness while his family discusses their fictional nature. These details describe a facility the family visits regularly, a monitoring station they've learned to treat as workplace rather than surveillance apparatus. The normalization is complete. They don't question why they're there because they've always been there, recording observations about their own existence for purposes they've stopped asking about. The voice actor's appearance raises questions about the relationship between observers and observed. Alex Borstein, Seth Green, Mila Kunis, and McFarlane enter the booth as the real versions of characters the Griffins thought they were. But if the Griffins aren't real, who's being monitored? The theory suggests the voice actors represent another layer of the observation system, handlers who occasionally interact with subjects to assess their responses to identity disruption. Lois's immediate acceptance of Alex Borstein, her delight at being voiced by someone from a prestige television show, demonstrates how thoroughly the monitoring has shaped her psychology. She's been trained to find comfort in surveillance rather than threat. The handlers can reveal themselves without compromising the study, because the subjects have been conditioned to integrate any revelation into their existing framework, rather than questioning the framework itself. The paycheck system deserves particular attention as evidence of institutional monitoring. Finally, Danny the intern distributes physical checks that reveal salary information, marital history, and organizational structure. The payroll apparently processes through a combined Fox-Disney system, placing the Griffins' compensation within actual corporate entertainment infrastructure. When Lois calls to dispute her salary, she reaches a hold system that plays music from another animated show, suggesting the monitoring encompasses multiple subject families across different programs. The Griffins aren't unique test cases. They're one dataset among many, all being documented through commentary sessions and payroll systems, and production meetings that feel like normal entertainment industry operations, but function as psychological evaluation checkpoints. The episode ends with the family resolving their conflicts through the shared revelation of their unreality. Peter and Lois reconcile because none of that stuff matters once they understand their existence serves external purposes. Lois explicitly frames their relationship as safe and familiar, choosing to cling to whatever this is, rather than investigate what this actually means. The commentary session functioned exactly as designed, surfacing tensions, processing disclosures, reintegrating the family unit into stable configuration for continued observation. Shannon Smith asks McFarlane to record additional episodes and promos, confirming the monitoring will continue indefinitely. The apparatus requires content. The subjects provide it. The Griffins return to their existence, the booth closes, and somewhere the recordings get filed alongside 17 seasons of previous documentation, building a dataset of human behavior that someone, somewhere, continues to study for reasons the subjects have learned not to question. The commentary track ends, but the monitoring never stops. Before we continue, if this video has been useful, consider subscribing. It costs nothing and helps us make more content like this. Now let's move on to the next season. Let's continue with the next season. This one raises the bar. Season 18. In Disney's The Reboot, the Griffin family sits in a focus group watching alternate versions of their own show, observing reality configurations where Lois becomes a wine executive protagonist, where Quahog transforms into a sexy supernatural teen drama, where Chris marries Trisha Takanawa after Peter and Lois die. A corporate representative named Vaughn Jenner, vice president of creative bankruptcy for Fox, presents these alternatives as potential reboots following Disney's acquisition of the network. The family watches themselves reconfigured, recast, reimagined for different audiences, their existence treated as intellectual property to be optimized rather than lives to be lived. Peter sees his reflection in the focus group window and doesn't recognize himself, repeatedly mistaking his own image for that woman before declaring, "She's beautiful." The episode ends with the reboot canceled because the executive who ordered it was just a squirrel who snuck into the office, the same squirrel who apparently greenlit Brooklyn Nine-Nine. The theory proposes that Disney's acquisition of Fox literally altered the metaphysical fabric of Quahog's reality. The Griffins exist within a universe that responds to ownership structures, reshaping itself based on which entity holds the rights. When Disney acquired Fox, the acquisition rippled through the dimensional substrate of the Family Guy universe, causing subtle but measurable changes in animation quality, character behavior, joke construction, and narrative possibility space. The reboot episode documents this transition by showing the family confronting alternate configurations of themselves, glimpses of realities that almost became their reality before corporate decisions stabilized their existence in something resembling the original form. The focus group format places the Griffins in the position of observing their own potential transformations, watching what they could become if different corporate priorities took hold. The Lois-centered reboot presents a universe where gender dynamics inverted, where Peter became the supportive spouse, and Lois became the career-focused protagonist. The sexy teen drama version killed Meg and Patty, transformed the characters into lesser-known Marvel superheroes, and featured aggressive product placement, including peach Coke consumption during crisis moments. The Chris and Trisha version eliminated Peter, Lois, Brian, Meg, and Stewie entirely, replacing the core family with a laugh-track sitcom starring secondary characters. Each configuration represents a reality that Disney's ownership made possible, timelines that branched from the acquisition moment and could have overwritten the original. Von Giener's corporate title, Vice President of Creative Bankruptcy, acknowledges the existential threat that ownership changes pose to fictional universes. Creative bankruptcy isn't metaphor in this context. It's literal description of what happens when a reality's creative potential gets exhausted through corporate optimization. The focus group participants hold power over the Griffin's existence simply by expressing preferences, their spontaneous comments affecting the jobs of hundreds of people, according to Von Giener. This framing treats the characters as employees whose continued existence depends on audience approval metrics, transforming ontological status into employment relationship. The Griffins can be fired from existing if the focus group doesn't like them. The animation itself shifts between reboot segments, each version rendered in slightly different style appropriate to its genre. The Lois version features brighter colors and softer lines, suitable for female-focused programming. The teen drama version employs darker palettes, dramatic lighting, and the slow-motion rain sequences that characterize CW aesthetics. The Chris-Trisha version uses flat, sitcom lighting with visible audience reaction shots. These style shifts demonstrate that the animation itself responds to genre requirements, that the visual fabric of the Griffin's reality is malleable based on corporate creative decisions. The characters literally look different, rendered by whatever aesthetic principles their designated genre demands. The Squirrel executive revelation at episode's end introduces chaos into the corporate ownership structure. If a squirrel can greenlight shows and order reboots, then the forces controlling the Griffin's reality aren't even coherent decision-makers, but random entities that wandered into positions of authority. This doesn't undermine the ownership theory, it amplifies it, suggesting the corporate structures that determine reality operate without rational oversight. Disney acquired Fox, but digital itself operates through bureaucratic processes that allow squirrels to make programming decisions. The Griffins exist at the mercy of corporate hierarchies that don't understand themselves, their reality subject to alteration by whatever creature happens to occupy the relevant office on any given day. The episode's conclusion restores the status quo with one modification. The focus group wanted more Joe Swanson. This preference manifests immediately as Joe appears at the Griffin house with big band records, inserting himself into their domestic space because audience research indicated his presence should increase. The final gag shows Joe calling households to announce, "Your show should have more Joe Swanson," his phone calls reaching the same family he's already visiting. Corporate feedback loops alter reality in real time, with character presence adjusted based on focus group data. Joe didn't choose to visit the Griffins. The acquisition's metaphysical consequences allocated more Joe to their reality because quantitative research suggested optimization in that direction. Peter's failure to recognize his own reflection throughout the episode suggests the acquisition damaged his self-perception at a fundamental level. He looks at himself in the focus group window and sees a stranger, a beautiful woman, rather than the fat man he knows himself to be. This dissociation could represent the psychological trauma of having your existence become corporate property, of knowing that your reality only continues because ownership structures permit it. Peter can't recognize himself because the self he's looking at might not be the same self that existed before Disney's acquisition. The reflection shows whoever the current ownership has configured him to be, and that configuration no longer matches his internal sense of identity. He's beautiful now, apparently. He just doesn't know it yet because his consciousness hasn't caught up with the metaphysical changes that his acquisition-altered body has already undergone. On to the next season, and this is where it gets unforgettable. Season 19. In The Marrying Kind, Stewie orders a mail-order bride from Ukraine named Zlata, complete with a backup corpse in case the first one dies during shipping. The dead woman in the crate was Zlata's sister, her arm gnawed off during the journey, and everyone treats this as minor inconvenience rather than international crime or existential horror. When Brian asks why Zlata would marry a baby, she explains simply, "In my country, everyone I know blows up." Death surrounds these characters constantly, arriving in shipping containers and wedding venues and hotel breakfast buffets, yet the Griffins themselves remain persistently, impossibly alive. Stewie gets married, gets cuckolded, gets divorced, and returns to baseline baby status without any of the experiences permanently altering his existence. The episode's B-plot involves Peter and Chris becoming so addicted to hotel breakfast buffets that they eventually commit multiple murders and serve prison sentences, all apparently without disrupting the family's fundamental continuity. The theory proposes that Death himself, the anthropomorphic personification who has appeared throughout the series as a recurring character with a speaking voice and personal relationships with the Griffins, has been actively protecting this specific family from permanent mortality, not out of affection, though he does seem fond of them, but because their continued existence serves some cosmic purpose that only Death understands. He's gone rogue from his celestial duties, shielding one Rhode Island family while collecting everyone else on schedule, and the show's persistent survival of unsurvivable situations represents his ongoing intervention rather than cartoon logic or narrative convenience. Death's relationship with the Griffin family began in Season 2's Death is a Bitch, where he sprains his ankle chasing Peter and has to stay at the Griffin house while recovering. During this period, nobody in the world can die, creating chaos that only resolves when Death returns to work. The episode establishes Death as a bureaucratic functionary rather than malevolent force, someone with a job and personal problems, and the capacity to form friendships with mortals. He attends parties with the Griffins. He has conversations with Peter about life and work. He demonstrates preferences and personality traits that suggest consciousness rather than mere cosmic function. This Death has the capacity to make choices, and choosing to protect the Griffins would be within his demonstrated behavioral range. The family's survival record defies statistical possibility even within the show's flexible physics. Peter has died on screen multiple times, each death somehow reversed or revealed as temporary. The family climbed Mount Everest, ran out of food, ate a dead teenager, nearly froze, and walked away without lasting consequence. Stewie has been shot, crushed, and exposed to lethal situations across hundreds of episodes. Brian got hit by a car and actually died, staying dead for multiple episodes before timeline manipulation brought him back, an intervention that required Stewie's technology, but might have been permitted by a Death who wanted that specific outcome. The show treats these survivals as comedy, but the pattern suggests systematic protection rather than random luck. Zlata's explanation for marrying a baby, that everyone she knows explodes, highlights the contrast between normal mortality and Griffin immunity. In Ukraine, people die. In Quahog, the Griffins don't. The same episode features a dead body shipped internationally, casual references to violence, and prison sentences for multiple homicides, all of which the family absorbs without permanent damage. Death is clearly operating in this universe, collecting souls from everywhere except Spooner Street. Something is intercepting the Reaper's scythe before it reaches the Griffin household, and the most logical candidate is Death himself, who has demonstrated both the capability and the motivation to make exceptions for people he likes. The cosmic purpose Death might be serving through Griffin protection remains deliberately obscure. Perhaps the family's chaotic existence generates narrative energy that sustains the universe itself. Perhaps their survival creates timeline branches that Death needs for some larger project. Perhaps the show's meta-awareness, its acknowledgement of existing as television, means Death understands he's protecting characters whose deaths would end the entertainment that gives the universe meaning. A Death who knows he exists within a show might calculate that protecting the protagonists serves the show's continuation, which serves his own continued existence as a character within it. The protection isn't altruism, it's self-preservation disguised as favoritism. Peter and Chris's breakfast buffet crime spree ends with prison sentences described as 12 to 15 years for hotel breakfast crime, yet subsequent episodes show the family intact, without any acknowledgement of incarceration. Either significant time passed between scenes, or the justice system's consequences don't apply to Griffins the way they apply to everyone else. Death's protection might extend beyond mortality to encompass all permanent negative consequences, shielding the family from lasting damage of any kind. Prison becomes temporary, injuries heal, marriages dissolve without emotional residue. The Griffins exist in a bubble of cosmic immunity that Death maintains through mechanisms the show hasn't revealed, perhaps because revealing them would compromise the protection itself. The Muppet Show references that bookend the episode take on additional significance through this lens. Peter mentions watching The Muppet Show with Stewie, and the song keeps invading characters' thoughts throughout the episode. Its lyrics asking, "Why do we always come here? I guess we'll never know." It's like some kind of torture to have to watch the show. The Muppets exist as felt creatures operated by external forces, performing for audiences they cannot see, trapped in entertainment loops that repeat indefinitely. If the Griffins occupy a similar position, protected from death specifically because their continued existence serves an audience's entertainment needs, then death becomes the handler, ensuring the puppets keep performing. He doesn't let them die because dead Griffins can't make people laugh, and making people laugh might be the only thing keeping this universe spinning. Death protects them because death needs them, and the cosmic purpose he serves is the same one we all serve when we tune in, the continuation of the show itself. Now we move into the next season, and it changes how you see the show. Season 20. In LASIK Instinct, Lois gets LASIK surgery to correct her vision, goes temporarily blind from complications, builds a fraudulent wellness empire called ICU around her blindness, regains her sight secretly, continues the fraud until exposed on a talk show, and faces trial on a black judge show before returning to normal life. The episode treats vision as commodity, something to be corrected, lost, exploited, and restored based on narrative convenience and financial opportunity. Lois's blindness makes her sympathetic. Her vision restoration makes her a fraud. The lesson appears to be about honesty, but the actual content concerns how much of reality people choose to perceive based on what that perception costs them. The theory proposes that impaired vision in the Griffin family serves protective function rather than disability. Peter's legendary stupidity, his inability to recognize obvious dangers, his cheerful navigation through situations that should traumatize him, all of it depends on not seeing clearly. His poor eyesight filters Quahog's true nature into something bearable, transforming cosmic horror into cartoon absurdity. The residents of this town die constantly, reality rewrites itself weekly, dimensional barriers break down regularly, and Peter Griffin remains happy because he literally cannot perceive the details that would drive a clearer-sighted person insane. The episode's opening establishes vision as treacherous. Dr. Hartman diagnoses Lois as farsighted, a pun that also describes her relationship to reality. She sees things that are distant from normal experience. His vision test includes a cow in a lab coat, some vultures in a cowboy hat, and a dog trying to trick a cat into a clothes dryer. Imagery that sounds like cartoon absurdity, but might represent actual Quahog phenomena that Lois's failing vision is accurately detecting. When she gets LASIK, the surgery doesn't improve her perception. It damages it so severely that she goes blind, suggesting the procedure tried to correct vision that was already seeing something it shouldn't. Peter's cognitive function deserves re-examination through this lens. He consistently fails to recognize dangers that are obvious to other characters, walking into situations that should kill him with cheerful obliviousness. His famous stupidity might not be intellectual deficit, but perceptual protection, a brain that refuses to process visual information that would reveal Quahog's true nature. When he looks at his reflection in the focus group window and sees a beautiful woman instead of himself, he's not being stupid, he's being protected, his visual processing system showing him something bearable rather than whatever his actual reflection would reveal to unfiltered perception. The ICU brand Lois builds around her blindness carries uncomfortable implications. ICU, as a wellness concept, depends on Lois not actually seeing anything, her blindness becoming the foundation for a philosophy of perception. The phrase works because Lois has stopped processing visual information, which, paradoxically, allows her to see people in ways that sighted perception prevents. Once her vision returns, she has to fake blindness to maintain the insight, suggesting that actual sight interferes with the kind of understanding ICU promises. Clear vision and genuine perception become mutually exclusive. You can see or you can understand, not both. Meg's role in the episode supports the protective blindness theory through inversion. She sees everything clearly, which is why she's miserable. Her empowerment videos, her cutting, her minor arson, all represent responses to perceiving Quahog without protective filters. When she tells Lois, "I feel helpless and worthless 24/7, she's describing the experience of clear perception in a reality that doesn't reward clarity. Meg functions as the family's unfiltered observer, seeing the truth about her circumstances and suffering appropriately, while her father's impaired vision keeps him cheerful, despite occupying the same horrific environment. The Doug subplot reinforces themes of perception and protective ignorance. Doug tricks the Griffin men into spending time with him, by manipulating their inability to see his obvious manipulation. Peter, Chris, and Stewie follow lists of activities without recognizing that Doug's father isn't actually making these requests. Their vision of the situation filtered through assumptions that protect them from seeing a lonely child's desperate scheme. When the truth emerges, it's not traumatic, it's touching, because the protective filtering transformed manipulation into found family rather than revealing something unbearable. Brian's offer to go poop in his shoes as revenge against Doug's absent father demonstrates how the family's impaired perception shapes their responses to cruelty. A clear-sighted person would recognize the father's neglect as serious harm requiring intervention. Brian sees it as an opportunity for scatological revenge, his perception filtered into something manageable and funny rather than tragic and systemic. The family's collective visual impairment doesn't make them victims, it makes them functional, able to respond to horrors with jokes rather than appropriate despair. Lois's trial on a black judge show ends with a sentence to pay your roommate back for his dog food, or whatever dumb shit this one's about. The judge explicitly acknowledging that the proceedings have no coherent relationship to the alleged crime. Justice in Quahog operates on logic that only makes sense to people who can't see clearly enough to recognize its absurdity. The legal system, like everything else in town, depends on impaired perception to function. Clear-sighted people would recognize that nothing here follows rules. The blurry-visioned accept the blur as normal and carry on. Peter never gets LASIK in this episode, his vision remaining protectively impaired, while Lois's gets corrected and damaged and restored. His continued inability to see clearly ensures his continued happiness, his cheerful ignorance maintained by eyes that refuse to show him what's actually there. The theory suggests this is feature rather than bug, that whatever force created or controls Quahog specifically impairs the perception of people it wants to keep functional. Peter Griffin sees poorly because seeing well would end him. His stupidity is gift rather than deficit, protective blur that transforms eldritch horror into family sitcom. He's protected. And the protection works because he can't see well enough to recognize it exists. Switching to the next season, this is where it all escalates. Season 21. In The Manchurian Candidate, Lois takes Peter to a sex therapist who hypnotizes him with a trigger phrase, extra extra, that causes him to enter a trance state and perform sexually in ways he normally refuses. The hypnosis works immediately and completely, transforming Peter from reluctant partner to enthusiastic performer whenever Lois activates the phrase. She exploits this control throughout the episode, triggering him at increasingly inappropriate moments, including during dinner at her parents' house, where the phrase accidentally activates through a celebrity news program and causes Peter to sexually pursue Lois's mother, Babs. The episode treats this as comedy, Lois's scheming backfiring hilariously, but the underlying mechanics describe a woman who sought out mind control technology to override her husband's consent and deployed it without hesitation whenever convenient. The theory proposes that Lois Griffin was programmed as a sleeper agent by her wealthy Pewterschmidt family, her normal housewife persona serving as cover identity for an operative who can be activated when needed for family interests. Her casual adoption of hypnotic control over Peter demonstrates familiarity with conditioning techniques that a piano teacher from Rhode Island shouldn't possess. She didn't learn about trigger phrases from the therapist, she recognized them, understood their application immediately, and deployed them with the comfort of someone who has seen this technology used before, possibly on herself. The Pewterschmidts didn't lose their daughter to a working-class marriage. They positioned an asset in a demographic they wanted monitored. Carter Pewterschmidt's wealth comes from sources the show has never fully explained, his fortune apparently spanning industries from media to manufacturing to sectors that require political influence and information gathering. A family operating at that level would naturally develop intelligence capabilities, and those capabilities would include human assets trained from childhood to gather information and influence outcomes. Lois grew up in that environment, educated at elite institutions, exposed to power brokers, then apparently chose to marry a factory worker and live in middle-class obscurity. This trajectory makes no sense unless the marriage itself serves a purpose, positioning a trained operative in a community that the Pewterschmidts wanted observed. The trigger phrase mechanism in this episode mirrors classic sleeper agent activation protocols. A specific verbal cue causes immediate behavioral change without conscious awareness or memory formation. Peter doesn't remember what happens when triggered. He enters an altered state, performs programmed behaviors, and returns to baseline with no recollection. This describes exactly how intelligence agencies have historically attempted to create controlled assets, the MK Ultra fantasy of a person who can be activated, used, and deactivated without ever knowing they've been compromised. Lois watches the therapist demonstrate this technology on her husband and immediately recognizes its potential, not as a curious housewife, but as someone who understands operational applications of behavioral conditioning. Lois's darker nature emerges throughout the series, in patterns consistent with programmed activation rather than organic personality. She's attempted murder, run for political office with ruthless efficiency, demonstrated combat capabilities that exceed her apparent training, and shown willingness to manipulate family members for personal advantage. These behaviors appear and disappear without consistent trigger, suggesting they represent program subroutines that activate when circumstances require them, rather than stable personality traits that would manifest consistently. The normal Lois, who makes breakfast and manages household chaos, exists as cover, while the activated Lois, who hypnotizes her husband and pursues power, emerges when her programming determines the situation warrants it. The episode's B-plot involves Stewie building a man cave to impress Brian and Chris, overhearing them mock his efforts, and ultimately capturing and torturing them with frozen quiches while threatening death by crossbow. This parallel narrative reinforces themes of hidden capability and triggered violence. Stewie presents as wanting friendship and approval, his surface motivation entirely sympathetic, but beneath that presentation lies willingness to imprison and potentially murder the people he claims to love. The episode suggests that Family Guy characters generally operate this way, presenting acceptable surfaces while concealing program depths that emerge under specific conditions. Lois simply represents the most sophisticated version of this pattern, her programming installed by professionals rather than developed through childhood trauma. Carter's reaction to Lois's marriage has always seemed disproportionately hostile for a wealthy man whose daughter married beneath her station. He actively works to undermine the marriage, separate them, and reclaim Lois for the family. This behavior makes more sense if Lois represents an investment rather than just a daughter, an asset whose positioning in working-class Quahog serves purposes that her continued marriage to Peter either advances or threatens, depending on circumstances Carter monitors. His hostility toward Peter isn't snobbery, it's operational concern about an asset's handler, someone who might accidentally or intentionally interfere with programming that Carter's organization installed. The sex therapy framing provides cover for what the episode actually depicts: a woman obtaining and deploying mind control technology against her spouse. The therapist offers hypnosis casually, as if behavioral conditioning were a normal therapeutic intervention, and Lois accepts it without ethical hesitation. She doesn't ask about consent implications or long-term effects. She doesn't worry about what she's doing to Peter's autonomy. She simply acquires a tool and uses it, the practiced response of someone trained to exploit available resources rather than question their appropriateness. A normal person would have reservations. Lois has none because her programming doesn't include reservations, only mission parameters that the trigger phrase helps her fulfill. The dinner at the Pewterschmidt mansion, where the trigger accidentally activates and causes chaos, might represent a demonstration rather than an accident. Carter and Babs witness what Lois can do with behavioral conditioning technology, confirming that their asset remains operational and capable of deploying advanced techniques. The accident shows them that Lois hasn't forgotten her training despite years in deep cover. She can still identify, obtain, and weaponize psychological control mechanisms when circumstances require. The episode frames this as an embarrassing mishap, but the Pewterschmidts now know their daughter remains a functional asset, ready for activation whenever family interests require someone with her particular combination of placement and capability. Let's dive into the next season, because this one's on another level. Season 22. In Unzipped Code, Cleveland loses his job as a mailman after a calendar photo shoot accidentally exposes part of his anatomy, gets hired at the brewery where he quickly demonstrates logistical genius, receives multiple promotions that leapfrog him over Peter, and ultimately quits to return to mail delivery because being a postman is who I am. The episode treats Cleveland's competence as a surprising revelation, his colleagues stunned that he can optimize delivery routes and streamline operations. Meanwhile, Peter sabotages Cleveland's success by planting a rat in the beer tank, gets caught, almost gets fired, and only keeps his job because Cleveland argues that companies need perfectly mediocre employees who are happy to do a thankless job for a mediocre salary. The episode celebrates Peter's mediocrity as essential to American commerce, while Cleveland voluntarily abandons success to resume a job he loves. The theory proposes that Chris Griffin is actually the most intelligent family member and deliberately conceals his capabilities to avoid the exploitation and responsibility that competence attracts. He learned early that being perceived as smart in the Griffin household leads to being assigned tasks, expected to solve problems, and burdened with obligations that his dumb persona allows him to escape. His apparent stupidity represents strategic optimization, the recognition that ignorance provides freedom while intelligence provides only additional labor. Chris is smart enough to understand that in his specific environment, appearing unintelligent maximizes quality of life. The episode's central conflict demonstrates what happens when competence becomes visible. Cleveland immediately gets promoted, given responsibilities, expected to perform at higher levels, and socially elevated in ways that create tension with his friends. His success makes Peter feel inadequate, damages their friendship, and ultimately forces Cleveland to choose between achievement and happiness. He chooses happiness, returning to mail delivery despite having proven he could succeed at corporate management. This trajectory validates Chris's strategy. Competence leads to pressure, pressure leads to misery, and the smart play is avoiding competence's visibility entirely. Chris's moments of unexpected insight throughout the series support the hidden intelligence theory. He occasionally delivers observations that demonstrate sophisticated understanding before immediately returning to baseline stupidity, as if catching himself and course-correcting. These flashes appear and disappear too quickly to be random luck, suggesting conscious management of perceived capability. A genuinely unintelligent person would be consistently unintelligent. Chris's intelligence surfaces and submerges with timing that suggests deliberate control, brief lapses in his performance that he quickly covers before anyone notices the pattern. Peter's mediocrity in this episode gets celebrated as essential to capitalism's functioning. Cleveland's speech saves Peter's job by arguing that companies need people content to work thanklessly for inadequate compensation, the hunched backbone of this country, who make everything possible without demanding recognition or advancement. This framing reveals what the Griffin family environment actually rewards: accepting your position without complaint, performing your assigned role without ambition, being reliably mediocre rather than disruptively excellent. Chris has internalized this lesson more thoroughly than anyone, understanding that excellence creates problems while adequacy creates peace. The episode's treatment of the brewery hierarchy illustrates how competence becomes trap. Mr. Lloyd repeatedly offers Cleveland advancement, each promotion creating new expectations and additional pressure. The executive floor invitation represents the final stage of the trap, complete absorption into a system that will demand everything Cleveland has to give. He recognizes this and escapes, but most people don't recognize it in time. Chris apparently recognized it very early, possibly in childhood, and structured his entire personality around avoiding the trap that captures people who let their intelligence show. Chris's relationship with his parents supports the strategic stupidity interpretation. Peter treats him as companion and equal rather than subordinate requiring management, sharing activities and conversations that he wouldn't share with someone he perceived as competition. Lois manages Chris minimally compared to Meg, whose visible competence, she actually goes to school, maintains social awareness, declares emotional intelligence, earns her constant criticism and burden. Chris's perceived stupidity grants him freedom that Meg's perceived capability denies her. He's learned that in this family, being seen as useless is better than being seen as useful. Stewie, the family's acknowledged genius, provides instructive contrast. His intelligence makes him isolated, burdened with capabilities nobody can help him exercise, trapped in a body that doesn't match his mind, and perpetually frustrated by people who can't understand him. Genius in the Griffin household produces loneliness and despair. Chris has apparently observed this dynamic and concluded that hiding capability produces better outcomes than displaying it. He might not be Stewie-level intelligent, but he's intelligent enough to recognize that Stewie's intelligence hasn't made Stewie happy. Brian's situation offers additional evidence for the strategic stupidity thesis. The talking dog with literary pretensions constantly demonstrates intelligence that earns him mockery, failed relationships, abandoned projects, and persistent dissatisfaction. His intelligence is visible enough to raise expectations, but insufficient to meet them, leaving him permanently disappointed with himself and his circumstances. Chris avoids this trap by keeping expectations so low that any achievement registers as pleasant surprise rather than inadequate performance. His strategy produces contentment that Brian's visibility prevents. The episode ends with Cleveland happy to be delivering mail again, having escaped the success that threatened his well-being. Peter remains employed despite sabotage, his mediocrity now officially recognized as valuable contribution. Chris watches all of this from his position of apparent obliviousness, learning nothing because he already knew everything the episode had to teach. He's been running the optimal strategy since childhood, hiding intelligence that would only burden him if visible, enjoying the freedom that incompetence provides while everyone around him suffers from the competence they can't conceal. He's the only one smart enough Griffin to recognize that being seen as dumb is the smartest thing he could possibly be. Now on to the next season, and this is the turning point. Season 23. In The Return of the King of Queens, Kevin James appears at the Griffin house after Lois sells the television, claiming that as Peter's last network TV viewer, Peter now has responsibility for him. Kevin's body literally begins disappearing throughout the episode, his limbs fading into transparency as streaming services make traditional sitcom stars irrelevant. A doctor confirms that Kevin needs live studio audience laughter to survive, that his existence depends on the laugh track that sustained him through years of network television. The family stages a nativity play performance to generate the laughter Kevin requires, his body reconstituting as the audience responds to simple jokes about Yelp reviews and immaculate conception. Old sitcom stars emerge from a cornfield like the baseball players in Field of Dreams, Jenna Elfman, Tony Danza, and others whose existence apparently also depends on audience engagement they can no longer reliably access. The theory proposes that Kevin James, playing himself rather than Doug Heffernan, recognized something fundamentally wrong about the Griffin family the moment he arrived in Quahog. His character exists in a universe where sitcom reality has rules that the Griffins somehow violate or transcend. He's a being from one entertainment construct, encountering a different entertainment construct and recognizing the incompatibility. His disappearing body represents what happens when sitcom characters leave the protective framework of their native reality, the slow dissolution that awaits anyone who steps outside the narrative structure that sustains them. The episode's premise, that viewers bear responsibility for characters they watch, inverts the normal relationship between audience and entertainment. Peter participated in Kevin's existence by watching, and stopping watching withdrew that participation. The show presents this as comedy, a ridiculous extension of parasocial relationship logic, but the underlying mechanics describe a universe where entertainment characters genuinely depend on audience engagement for survival. Kevin's fading body isn't metaphor. It's literal documentation of what happens when the attention that sustains fictional beings gets mirrored to other platforms. Kevin's adjustment difficulties throughout the episode reveal how sitcom reality differs from whatever reality the Griffins inhabit. He expects warm-up comedians before entering rooms, treats sporting events as occasions for large bowls of popcorn that fly everywhere during excitement, and can't understand how bills get paid without father-in-law phone calls. These expectations aren't personality quirks, they're the rules of his native reality, the sitcom physics that governed his existence before he crossed into Quahog. The Griffins operate under different rules, ones that Kevin finds confusing and wrong, because they don't match the framework he was built for. The cornfield emergence of sitcom stars near the episode's end explicitly references Field of Dreams, a film about baseball players who return from death when someone builds them an appropriate venue. The sitcom stars emerging from the cornfield aren't visiting from Hollywood, they're manifesting from whatever liminal space holds entertainment characters between appearances, drawn by the audience engagement that Kevin's performance generated. Tony Danza and Jenna Elfman exist in some form when not on screen, waiting in cornfields for circumstances that allow them to become visible again. The Griffins accidentally created those circumstances by staging live performance with genuine audience response. The doctor's diagnosis that Kevin needs live audience laughter to survive identifies the specific mechanism sustaining sitcom existence. Recorded laugh tracks apparently don't count. The laughter has to be genuine, immediate, present in the same physical space as the performance. This requirement explains why streaming killed sitcom stars. Streaming eliminates the live audience component that sitcom reality requires for character maintenance. Kevin James doesn't need viewers, he needs laughers. People physically present, responding in real time to his performance. Everything else is insufficient simulation of the engagement that actually sustains him. Peter's defense of network television near the episode's climax articulates the show's genuine philosophy about entertainment purpose. He compares network TV to the Bible, plots that don't make sense, over-the-top characters, tired stories repeated endlessly, nobody learning lessons, no authentic female perspective. These criticisms apply equally to Family Guy itself, which the show acknowledges by having Lois attempt to contribute before Peter interrupts her. The speech argues that entertainment's purpose isn't sophistication or growth, but comfort. the reliable delivery of familiar feelings, regardless of artistic merit. Network TV succeeds by this metric where prestige streaming fails. Kevin's physical reconstitution during the nativity play demonstrates that audience laughter literally rebuilds sitcom characters from dissolution. His limbs return as people laugh, his body becoming solid again through accumulated response. This isn't healing in any medical sense, it's reality reconstruction, the audience's engagement generating the substance that Kevin's existence requires. The Griffins discovered how to manufacture a sitcom star's survival requirements by creating conditions that simulate the live audience experience Kevin's native reality provided automatically. They essentially performed CPR on his existence using laughter as the resuscitation mechanism. The episode ends with Kevin returning to Hollywood with Les Moonves, sitcom reality reasserting itself through the industry structures that produce and distribute entertainment. Kevin didn't stay in Quahog because Quahog operates under rules that don't support his kind of existence. He needed to return to an environment calibrated for sitcom physics, where laugh tracks and live audiences and network schedules maintain the reality framework he was designed to inhabit. The Griffins remain in their own reality, one that apparently sustains them through different mechanisms, their survival not dependent on laugh tracks because they exist in an animated construct rather than a live-action one. Kevin James recognized the difference immediately upon arrival. He just needed to survive long enough to escape back to the reality that could actually support him. If you made it this far, make sure you're subscribed. We've got a lot more coming, and you won't want to miss what's next.